A Christmas tree and a wedding. A story. The other day I saw a wedding. But no, I had better tell you about the Christmas tree. The wedding was nice, I liked it very much, but the other incident was better. I don't know how it was that, looking at that wedding, I thought of that Christmas tree. This was what happened. Just 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's party. The giver of the party was a well-known and businesslike personage, with connections, with a large circle of acquaintances, and a good many schemes on hand, so that it may be supposed that this party was an excuse for getting the parents together and discussing various interesting matters in an innocent, casual way. I was an outsider. I had no interesting matter to contribute, and so I spent the evening rather independently. There was another gentleman present who was, I fancied, of no special rank or family, and who, like me, had simply turned up at this family festivity. He was the first to catch my eye. He was a tall, lanky man, very grave and very correctly dressed. But one could see that he was in no mood for merrymaking and family festivity. Whenever he withdrew into a corner, he left off smiling and knitted his bushy black brows. He had not a single acquaintance in the party, except his host. One could see that he was fearfully bored, but that he was valiantly keeping up the part of a man perfectly happy and enjoying himself. I learned afterwards that this was a gentleman from the provinces, who had a critical and perplexing piece of business in Petersburg, who had brought a letter of introduction to our host, for whom our host was, by no means con amore, using his interest, and whom he had invited, out of civility, to his children's party. He did not play cards, cigars were not offered him. Everyone avoided entering into conversation with him, most likely recognizing the bird from its feathers. And so my gentleman was forced to sit the whole evening stroking his whiskers simply to have something to do with his hands. His whiskers were certainly very fine, but he stroked them so zealously that, looking at him, one might have supposed that the whiskers were created first, and the gentleman only attached to them in order to stroke them. In addition to this individual who assisted in this way at our host's family festivity, he had 5 fat, well-fed boys. I was attracted, too, by another gentleman. But he was quite of a different sort. He was a personage. He was called Yulian Mastakovich. From the first glance, one could see that he was an honored guest, and stood in the same relation to our host as our host stood in relation to the gentleman who was stroking his whiskers. Our host and hostess said no end of polite things to him, waited on him hand and foot, pressed him to drink, flattered him, brought their visitors up to be introduced to him, but did not take him to be introduced to anyone else. I noticed that tears glistened in our host's eyes when he remarked about the party that he had rarely spent an evening so agreeably. I felt as it were frightened in the presence of such a personage, and so, after admiring the children, I went away into a little parlor, which was quite empty, and sat down in an arbor of flowers which filled up almost half the room. The children were all incredibly sweet, and resolutely refused to model themselves on the grown-ups, regardless of all the admonitions of their governesses and mammas. They stripped the Christmas tree to the last sweetmeat in the twinkling of an eye, and had succeeded in breaking half the playthings before they knew what was destined for which. Particularly charming was a black-eyed, curly-headed boy, who kept trying to shoot me with his wooden gun. But my attention was still more attracted by his sister, a girl of 11, quiet, dreamy, pale, with big, prominent, dreamy eyes, exquisite as a little Cupid. The children hurt her feelings in some way, and so she came away from them to the same empty parlor in which I was sitting, and played with her doll in the corner. The visitors respectfully pointed out her father, a wealthy contractor, and someone whispered that 300,000 rubles were already set aside for her dowry. I turned round to glance at the group who were interested in such a circumstance, and my eye fell on Yulian Mastakovich, who, with his hands behind his back and his head on one side, was listening with the greatest attention to these gentlemen's idle gossip. Afterwards I could not help admiring the discrimination of the host and hostess in the distribution of the children's presents. The little girl, who had already a portion of 300,000 rubles, received the costliest doll. Then followed presents diminishing in value in accordance with the rank of the parents of these happy children. Finally, the child of lowest degree, a thin, freckled, red-haired little boy of 10, got nothing but a book of stories about the marvels of nature and tears of devotion, etc., without pictures or even woodcuts. He was the son of a poor widow, the governess of the children of the house, an oppressed and scared little boy. He was dressed in a short jacket of inferior nankin. After receiving his book, he walked round the other toys for a long time. He longed to play with the other children, but did not dare. It was evident that he already felt and understood his position. I love watching children. Their first independent approaches to life are extremely interesting. I noticed that the red-haired boy was so fascinated by the costly toys of the other children, especially by a theater in which he certainly longed to take some part, that he made up his mind to sacrifice his dignity. He smiled and began playing with the other children. He gave away his apple to a fat-faced little boy who had a mass of goodies tied up in a pocket handkerchief already, and even brought himself to carry another boy on his back, simply not to be turned away from the theater. But an insolent youth gave him a heavy thump a minute later. The child did not dare to cry. Then the governess, his mother, made her appearance and told him not to interfere with the other children's playing. The boy went away to the same room in which was the little girl. She let him join her, and the two set to work very eagerly dressing the expensive doll. I had been sitting more than half an hour in the ivy arbor, listening to the little prattle of the red-haired boy and the beauty with the dowry of 300,000 who was nursing her doll, when Yulian Mastakovich suddenly walked into the room. He had taken advantage of the general commotion following a quarrel among the children to step out of the drawing room. I had noticed him a moment before talking very cordially to the future heiress's papa, whose acquaintance he had just made, of the superiority of one branch of the service over another. Now he stood in hesitation and seemed to be reckoning something on his fingers. 300, he was whispering. 11, 12, 13, and so on. 16 5 years. Supposing it is at 4% 5 times 12 is 60. Yes, to that 60. Well, in 5 years, we may assume it will be 400. Yes. But he won't stick to 4%, the rascal. He can get 8 or 10. Well, 500, let us say, 500 at least. That's certain. Well, say a little more for frills. Chma. His hesitation was at an end. He blew his nose and was on the point of going out of the room when he suddenly glanced at the little girl and stopped short. He did not see me behind the pots of greenery. It seemed to me that he was greatly excited. Either his calculations had affected his imagination or something else, for he rubbed his hands and could hardly stand still. This excitement reached its utmost limit when he stopped and bent another resolute glance at the future heiress. He was about to move forward, but first looked round, then moving on tiptoe, as though he felt guilty, he advanced towards the children. He approached with a little smile, bent down and kissed her on the head. The child, not expecting this attack, uttered a cry of alarm. "What are you doing here, sweet child?" he asked in a whisper, looking round and patting the girl's cheek. "We are playing." With him, Yulian Mastakovich looked askance at the boy. "You had better go into the drawing room, my dear," he said to him. The boy looked at him open-eyed and did not utter a word. Yulian Mastakovich looked round him again, and again bent down to the little girl. "And what is this you've got, a dolly, dear child?" he asked. "Yes, a dolly," answered the child, frowning and a little shy. "A dolly? And do you know, dear child, what your dolly is made of?" "I don't know," the child answered in a whisper, hanging her head. "It's made of rags, darling." "You had better go into the drawing room to your playmates, boy," said Yulian Mastakovich, looking sternly at the boy. The boy and girl frowned and clutched at each other. They did not want to be separated. "And do you know why they gave you that doll?" asked Yulian Mastakovich, dropping his voice to a softer and softer tone. "I don't know." "Because you have been a sweet and well-behaved child all the week." At this point, Yulian Mastakovich, more excited than ever, speaking in most dulcet tones, asked at last, in a hardly audible voice choked with emotion and impatience. "And will you love me, dear little girl, when I come and see your papa and mama?" Saying this, Yulian Mastakovich tried once more to kiss the dear little girl. But the red-haired boy, seeing that the little girl was on the point of tears, clutched her hand and began whimpering from sympathy for her. Yulian Mastakovich was angry and earnest. Go away from here, go away," he said to the boy. "Go into the drawing room. Go in there to your playmates." "No, he needn't. "You go away," said the little girl. Leave him alone," she said, almost crying. Someone made a sound at the door. Yulian Mastakovich instantly raised his majestic person and took alarm. But the red-haired boy was even more alarmed than Yulian Mastakovich. He abandoned the little girl and, slinking along by the wall, stole out of the parlor into the dining room. To avoid arousing suspicion, Yulian Mastakovich, too, went into the dining room. He was as red as a lobster, and, glancing into the looking-glass, seemed to be ashamed at himself. He was perhaps vexed with himself for his impetuosity and hastiness. Possibly, he was at first so much impressed by his calculations, so inspired and fascinated by them, that in spite of his seriousness and dignity, he made up his mind to behave like a boy and directly approach the object of his attentions, even though she could not be really the object of his attentions for another 5 years at least. I followed the estimable gentleman into the dining room, and there beheld a strange spectacle. Yulian Mastakovich, flushed with vexation and anger, was frightening the red-haired boy, who, retreating from him, did not know where to run in his terror. "Go away, what are you doing here? Go away, you scamp, are you after the fruit here, eh? Get along, you naughty boy. Get along, you sniveler, to your playmates." The panic-stricken boy, in his desperation, tried creeping under the table. Then his persecutor, in a fury, took out his large batiste handkerchief and began flicking it under the table at the child, who kept perfectly quiet. It must be observed that Yulian Mastakovich was a little inclined to be fat. He was a sleek, red-faced, solidly built man paunchy with thick legs, what is called a fine figure of a man, round as a nut. He was perspiring, breathless, and fearfully flushed. At last he was almost rigid. So great was his indignation and perhaps, who knows, his jealousy. I burst into loud laughter. Yulian Mastakovich turned round and, in spite of all his consequence, was overcome with confusion. At that moment from the opposite door, our host came in. The boy crept out from under the table and wiped his elbows and his knees. Yulian Mastakovich hastened to put to his nose the handkerchief which he was holding in his hand by one end. Our host looked at the three of us in some perplexity, but as a man who knew something of life and looked at it from a serious point of view, he at once availed himself of the chance of catching his visitor by himself. "Here, this is the boy," he said, pointing to the red-haired boy, "for whom I had the honor to solicit your influence." "Ah," said Yulian Mastakovich, who had hardly quite recovered himself. "The son of my children's governess," said our host, in a tone of a petitioner, "a poor woman, the widow of an honest civil servant, and therefore, Yulian Mastakovich, if it were possible." "Oh, no," Yulian Mastakovich made haste to answer. "No, excuse me, Philip Alexievich, it's quite impossible. I've made inquiries, there's no vacancy, and if there were, there are 20 applicants who have far more claim than he. I am very sorry, very sorry." "What a pity," said our host. "He is a quiet, well-behaved boy." "A great rascal, as I notice," answered Yulian Mastakovich with a nervous twist of his lip. "Get along, boy, why are you standing there? Go to your playmates," he said, addressing the child. At that point he could not contain himself and glanced at me out of one eye. I, too, could not contain myself and laughed straight in his face. Yulian Mastakovich turned away at once, and in a voice calculated to reach my ear, asked who was that strange young man. They whispered together and walked out of the room. I saw Yulian Mastakovich afterwards shaking his head incredulously as our host talked to him. After laughing to my heart's content, I returned to the drawing room. There the great man, surrounded by fathers and mothers of families, including the host and hostess, was saying something very warmly to a lady to whom he had just been introduced. The lady was holding by the hand the little girl with whom Yulian Mastakovich had had the scene in the parlor a little while before. Now he was launching into praises and raptures over the beauty, the talents, the grace and the charming manners of the charming child. He was unmistakably making up to the mamma. The mother listened to him, almost with tears of delight. The father's lips were smiling. Our host was delighted at the general satisfaction. All the guests, in fact, were sympathetically gratified. Even the children's games were checked, that they might not hinder the conversation. The whole atmosphere was saturated with reverence. I heard afterwards the mamma of the interesting child, deeply touched, beg Yulian Mastakovich, in carefully chosen phrases, to do her the special honor of bestowing upon them the precious gift of his acquaintance, and heard with what unaffected delight Yulian Mastakovich accepted the invitation, and how afterwards the guests, dispersing in different directions, moving away with the greatest propriety, poured out to one another the most touchingly flattering comments upon the contractor, his wife, his little girl, and above all, upon Yulian Mastakovich. "Is that gentleman married?" I asked, almost aloud, of one of my acquaintances, who was standing nearest to Yulian Mastakovich. Yulian Mastakovich flung a searching and vindictive glance at me. "No," answered my acquaintance, chagrined to the bottom of his heart by the awkwardness of which I had intentionally been guilty. "I passed lately by a certain church. I was struck by the crowd of people in carriages. I heard people talking of the wedding. It was a cloudy day, it was beginning to sleet. I made my way through the crowd at the door and saw the bridegroom. He was a sleek, well-fed, round, paunchy man, very gorgeously dressed up. He was running fussily about, giving orders. At last the news passed through the crowd that the bride was coming. I squeezed my way through the crowd and saw a marvelous beauty, who could scarcely have reached her first season. But the beauty was pale and melancholy. She looked preoccupied. I even fancied that her eyes were red with recent weeping. The classic severity of every feature of her face gave a certain dignity and seriousness to her beauty. But through that sternness and dignity, through that melancholy, could be seen the look of childish innocence, something indescribably naive, fluid, youthful, which seemed mutely begging for mercy. People were saying that she was only just 16. Glancing attentively at the bridegroom, I suddenly recognized him as Yulian Mastakovich, whom I had not seen for 5 years. I looked at her. My God! I began to squeeze my way as quickly as I could out of the church. I heard people saying in the crowd that the bride was an heiress, that she had a dowry of 500,000, and a trousseau worth ever so much. It was a good stroke of business, though, I thought as I made my way into the street. Polzunkov. A story. I began to scrutinize the man closely. Even in his exterior, there was something so peculiar that it compelled one, however far away one's thoughts might be, to fix one's eyes upon him and go off into the most irrepressible roar of laughter. That is what happened to me. I must observe that the little man's eyes were so mobile, or perhaps he was so sensitive to the magnetism of every eye fixed upon him, that he almost by instinct guessed that he was being observed, turned at once to the observer and anxiously analyzed his expression. His continual mobility, his turning and twisting, made him look strikingly like a dancing doll. It was strange. He seemed afraid of jeers, in spite of the fact that he was almost getting his living by being a buffoon for all the world, and exposed himself to every buffet in a moral sense and even in a physical one, judging from the company he was in. Voluntary buffoons are not even to be pitied. But I noticed at once that this strange creature, this ridiculous man, was by no means a buffoon by profession. There was still something gentlemanly in him. His very uneasiness, his continual apprehensiveness about himself, were actually a testimony in his favor. It seemed to me that his desire to be obliging was due more to kindness of heart than to mercenary considerations. He readily allowed them to laugh their loudest at him and in the most unseemly way to his face. But at the same time I am ready to take my oath on it, his heart ached, and was sore at the thought that his listeners were so caddishly brutal as to be capable of laughing, not at anything said or done, but at him, at his whole being, at his heart, at his head, at his appearance, at his whole body, flesh and blood. I am convinced that he felt at that moment all the foolishness of his position. But the protest died away in his heart at once, though it invariably sprang up again in the most heroic way. I am convinced that all this was due to nothing else but a kind heart, and not to fear of the inconvenience of being kicked out and being unable to borrow money from someone. This gentleman was forever borrowing money, that is, he asked for alms in that form, when after playing the fool and entertaining them at his expense, he felt in a certain sense entitled to borrow money from them. But good heavens, what a business the borrowing was! And with what a countenance he asked for the loan! I could not have imagined that on such a small space as the wrinkled, angular face of that little man-room could be found, at one and the same time, for so many different grimaces, for such strange, variously characteristic shades of feeling, such absolutely killing expressions. Everything was there shame and an assumption of insolence, and vexation at the sudden flushing of his face, and anger and fear of failure, and entreaty to be forgiven for having dared to pester, and a sense of his own dignity, and a still greater sense of his own abjectness. All this passed over his face like lightning. For 6 whole years, he had struggled along in God's world in this way, and so far had been unable to take up a fitting attitude at the interesting moment of borrowing money. I need not say that he never could grow callous and completely abject. His heart was too sensitive, too passionate. I will say more, indeed. In my opinion, he was one of the most honest and honorable men in the world, but with a little weakness of being ready to do anything abject at anyone's bidding, good-naturedly and disinterestedly, simply to oblige a fellow creature. In short, he was what is called a rag, in the fullest sense of the word. The most absurd thing was that he was dressed like anyone else, neither worse nor better, tidily, even with a certain elaborateness, and actually had pretensions to respectability and personal dignity. This external equality and internal inequality, his uneasiness about himself, and at the same time his continual self-depreciation, all this was strikingly incongruous and provocative of laughter and pity. If he had been convinced in his heart, and in spite of his experience it did happen to him at moments to believe this, that his audience were the most good-natured people in the world, who were simply laughing at something amusing, and not at the sacrifice of his personal dignity, he would most readily have taken off his coat, put it on wrong side outwards, and have walked about the streets in that attire for the diversion of others and his own gratification. But equality he could never anyhow attain. Another trait, the queer fellow was proud, and even by fits and starts, when it was not too risky, generous. It was worth seeing and hearing how he could sometimes, not sparing himself, consequently with pluck, almost with heroism, dispose of one of his patrons who had infuriated him to madness. But that was at moments. In short, he was a martyr in the fullest sense of the word, but the most useless and consequently the most comic martyr. There was a general discussion going on among the guests. All at once I saw our queer friend jump upon his chair and call out at the top of his voice, anxious for the exclusive attention of the company. "Listen," the master of the house whispered to me. "He sometimes tells the most curious stories. Does he interest you?" I nodded and squeezed myself into the group. The sight of a well-dressed gentleman jumping upon his chair and shouting at the top of his voice did, in fact, draw the attention of all. Many who did not know the queer fellow looked at one another in perplexity. The others roared with laughter. I knew Fedosey Nikolaich. "I ought to know Fedosey Nikolaich better than anyone," cried the queer fellow from his elevation. "Gentlemen, allow me to tell you something. I can tell you a good story about Fedosey Nikolaich. I know a story exquisite. Tell it, Osip Mihalich, tell it. Tell it. Listen. Listen, listen. I begin, but gentlemen, this is a peculiar story. Very good, very good. It's a comic story. Very good, excellent, splendid. Get on. It is an episode in the private life of your humble. But why do you trouble yourself to announce that it's comic? And even somewhat tragic? In short, the story which it will afford you all pleasure to hear me now relate, gentlemen, the story, in consequence of which I have come into company so interesting and profitable. No puns. This story. In short, the story make haste and finish the introduction. The story, which has its value. A fair-haired young man with mustaches pronounced in a husky voice, dropping his hand into his coat pocket and, as though by chance, pulling out a purse instead of his handkerchief. The story, my dear sirs, after which I should like to see many of you in my place. And finally, the story, in consequence of which I have not married. Married? A wife? Polzunkov tried to get married. I confess I should like to see Madame Polzunkov. Allow me to inquire the name of the would-be Madame Polzunkov, piped a youth, making his way up to the storyteller. And so for the first chapter, gentlemen. It was just 6 years ago, in spring, the 31st of March, note the date, gentlemen, on the eve of the 1st of April, cried a young man with ringlets. You are extraordinarily quick at guessing. It was evening. Twilight was gathering over the district town of N. The moon was about to float out. Everything in proper style, in fact. And so in the very late twilight I, too, floated out of my poor lodging on the sly after taking leave of my restricted granny, now dead. Excuse me, gentlemen, for making use of such a fashionable expression, which I heard for the last time from Nikolay Nikolaich. But my granny was indeed restricted. She was blind, dumb, deaf, stupid, everything you please. I confess I was in a tremor. I was prepared for great deeds. My heart was beating like a kitten's when some bony hand clutches it by the scruff of the neck. Excuse me, Monsieur Polzunkov. What do you want? Tell it more simply. Don't overexert yourself, please. All right, said Osip Mihalich, a little taken aback. I went into the house of Fedosy Nikolaich, the house that he had bought. Fedosy Nikolaich, as you know, is not a mere colleague, but the full-blown head of a department. I was announced, and was at once shown into the study. I can see it now. The room was dark, almost dark, but candles were not brought. Behold, Fedosy Nikolaich walks in. There he and I were left in the darkness. Whatever happened to you? Asked an officer. What do you suppose? Asked Polzunkov, turning promptly with a convulsively working face to the young man with ringlets. Well, gentlemen, a strange circumstance occurred, though indeed there was nothing strange in it. It was what is called an everyday affair. I simply took out of my pocket a roll of paper. And he a roll of paper. Paper notes. Paper notes, and we exchanged. I don't mind betting that there's a flavor of bribery about it, observed a respectably dressed, closely cropped young gentleman. Bribery, Polzunkov caught him up. Oh, may I be a liberal, such as many I have seen. If you too, when it is your lot to serve in the provinces, do not warm your hands at your country's hearth. For as an author said, even the smoke of our native land is sweet to us. She is our mother, gentlemen, our mother Russia, we are her babes, and so we suck her. There was a roar of laughter. Only would you believe it, gentlemen, I have never taken bribes, said Polzunkov, looking round at the whole company distrustfully. A prolonged burst of Homeric laughter drowned Polzunkov's words in guffaws. It really is so, gentlemen. But here he stopped, still looking round at everyone with a strange expression of face. Perhaps, who knows? At that moment the thought came into his mind that he was more honest than many of all that honorable company. Anyway, the serious expression of his face did not pass away till the general merriment was quite over. And so, Polzunkov began again when all was still. Though I never did take bribes, yet that time I transgressed. I put in my pocket a bribe. From a bribe-taker. That is, there were certain papers in my hands which, if I had cared to send to a certain person, it would have gone ill with Fedosy Nikolaich. So then he bought them from you. He did. Did he give much? He gave as much as many a man nowadays would sell his conscience for complete, with all its variations. If only he could get anything for it. But I felt as though I were scalded when I put the money in my pocket. I really don't understand what always comes over me, gentlemen, but I was more dead than alive. My lips twitched and my legs trembled. Well, I was to blame, entirely to blame. I was utterly conscience-stricken. I was ready to beg Fedosy Nikolaich's forgiveness. Well, what did he do? Did he forgive you? But I didn't ask his forgiveness. I only mean that that is how I felt. Then I have a sensitive heart, you know. I saw he was looking me straight in the face. Have you no fear of God, Osip Mihailych? Said he. Well, what could I do? From a feeling of propriety, I put my head on one side, and I flung up my hands. In what way, said I, have I no fear of God, Fyodor Nikolaich? But I just said that from a feeling of propriety. I was ready to sink into the earth. After being so long a friend of our family, after being, I may say, like a sun-end who knows what heaven had in store for us, Osip Mihailych, and all of a sudden to inform against me to think of that now. What am I to think of mankind after that, Osip Mihailych? Yes, gentlemen, he did read me a lecture. Come, he said, you tell me what I am to think of mankind after that, Osip Mihailych. What is he to think? I thought, and do you know, there was a lump in my throat, and my voice was quivering, and knowing my hateful weakness, I snatched up my hat. Where are you off to, Osip Mihailych? Surely on the eve of such a day, you cannot bear malice against me. What wrong have I done you? Fyodor Nikolaich, I said, Fyodor Nikolaich. In fact, I melted, gentlemen, I melted like a sugar stick. And the roll of notes that was lying in my pocket, that, too, seemed screaming out, you ungrateful brigand, you accursed thief. It seemed to weigh 100 weight. If only it had weighed 100 weight. I see, says Fyodor Nikolaich, I see your penitence. You know tomorrow, Saint Mary of Egypt's day. Well, don't weep, said Fyodor Nikolaich, that's enough, you've erred and you are penitent. Come along. Maybe I may succeed in bringing you back again into the true path, says he. Maybe my modest penates, yes penades. I remember he used that expression, the rascal, will warm, says he, your harden. I will not say hardened, but erring heart. He took me by the arm, gentlemen, and led me to his family circle. A cold shiver ran down my back, I shuddered. I thought, with what eyes shall I present myself, you must know, gentlemen. What shall I say? A delicate position had arisen here. Not Madame Polzunkov. Maria Fedosievna, only she was not destined, you know, to bear the name you have given her. She did not attain that honor. Fyodor Nikolaich was right, you see, when he said that I was almost looked upon as a son in the house. It had been so, indeed, 6 months before, when a certain retired junker called Mihailo Maximych Divigilov was still living. But by God's will he died, and he put off settling his affairs till death settled his business for him. Well, never mind, gentlemen, forgive me, it was a slip of the tongue. It's a bad pun, but it doesn't matter its being bad. What happened was far worse, when I was left, so to say, with nothing in prospect but a bullet through the brain. For that junker, though he would not admit me into his house, he lived in grand style, for he had always known how to feather his nest. Yet perhaps correctly he believed me to be his son. Yes, that was how it was. So they began to cold shoulder me at Fyodor Nikolaich's. I noticed things, I kept quiet, but all at once, unluckily for me, or perhaps luckily, a cavalry officer galloped into our little town like snow on our head. His business buying horses for the army was light and active, in cavalry style, but he settled himself solidly at Fyodor Nikolaich's, as though he were laying siege to it. I approached the subject in a roundabout way, as my nasty habit is. I said one thing and another, asking him what I had done to be treated so, saying that I was almost like a son to him, and when might I expect him to behave more like a father? Well, he began answering me. And when he begins to speak, you are in for a regular epic in 12 cantos, and all you can do is to listen, lick your lips, and throw up your hands in delight. And not a ha'porth of sense, at least there's no making out the sense. You stand puzzled like a fool, he puts you in a fog, he twists about like an eel and wriggles away from you. It's a special gift, a real gift. It's enough to frighten people, even if it is no concern of theirs. I tried one thing and another, and went hither and thither. I took the lady songs, and presented her with sweets, and thought of witty things to say to her. I tried sighing and groaning. My heart aches, I said, it aches from love, and I went in for tears and secret explanations. Man is foolish, you know. I never reminded myself that I was 30. Not a bit of it. I tried all my arts. It was no go. It was a failure, and I gained nothing but jeers and jibes. I was indignant, I was choking with anger. I slunk off and would not set foot in the house. I thought and made up my mind to denounce him. Well, of course, it was a shabby thing I meant to give away a friend, I confess. I had heaps of material, and splendid material, a grand case. It brought me 1,500 rubles when I changed it, and my report on it for banknotes. Ah, so that was the bribe. Yes, sir, that was the bribe, and it was a bribe taker who had to pay it, and I didn't do wrong, I can assure you. Well, now I will go on. He drew me, if you will kindly remember, more dead than alive into the room where they were having tea. They all met me, seeming as it were offended, that is, not exactly offended, but so hurt that it was simply. They seemed shattered, absolutely shattered, and at the same time there was a look of becoming dignity on their faces, a gravity in their expression, something fatherly, parental. The prodigal son had come back, to them that's what it had come to. They made me sit down to tea, but there was no need to do that. I felt as though a samovar was toiling in my bosom, and my feet were like ice. I was humbled, I was cowed. Marya Fominishna, his wife, addressed me familiarly from the first word. How is it you have grown so thin, my boy? I've not been very well, Marya Fominishna, I said. My wretched voice shook. And then quite suddenly she must have been waiting for a chance to get a dig at me. The old snake, she said. I suppose your conscience felt ill at ease, Osip Mihalich, my dear. Our fatherly hospitality was a reproach to you. You have been punished for the tears I have shed. Yes, upon my word, she really said that she had the conscience to say it. Why, that was nothing to her, she was a terror. She did nothing but sit there and pour out tea. But if you were in the market, my darling, I thought you'd shout louder than any fishwife there. That's the kind of woman she was. And then, to my undoing, the daughter, Marya Fedosievna, came in all her innocence, a little pale and her eyes red as though she had been weeping. I was bowled over on the spot like a fool. But it turned out afterwards that the tears were a tribute to the cavalry officer. He had made tracks for home and taken his hook for good and all, for you know it was high time for him to be off. I may as well mention the fact here. Not that his leave was up precisely, but you see. It was only later that the loving parents grasped the position and had found out all that had happened. What could they do? They hushed their trouble up in addition to the family. Well, I could not help it. As soon as I looked at her, I was done for. I stole a glance at my hat. I wanted to get up and make off. But there was no chance of that. They took away my hat. I must confess, I did think of getting off without it. Well, I thought, but no, they latched the doors. There followed friendly jokes, winking, little airs and graces. I was overcome with embarrassment, said something stupid, talked nonsense about love. My charmer sat down to the piano, and with an air of wounded feeling, sang the song about the hussar who leaned upon the sword that finished me off. Well, said Fedosy Nikolaich, all is forgotten, come to my arms. I fell just as I was, with my face on his waistcoat. My benefactor. You are a father to me, said I. And I shed floods of hot tears. Lord, have mercy on us, what a to-do there was. He cried, his good lady cried, Nastenka cried. There was a flaxen-headed creature there, she cried too. That wasn't enough. The younger children crept out of all the corners, the Lord had filled their quiver full, and they howled too. Such tears, such emotion, such joy. They found their prodigal, it was like a soldier's return to his home. Then followed refreshments, we played forfeits, and I have a pain. Where is it? In my heart. Who gave it you? My charmer blushed. The old man and I had some punch. They won me over, and did for me completely. I returned to my grandmother with my head in a whirl. I was laughing all the way home. For full 2 hours I paced up and down our little room. I waked up my old granny and told her of my happiness. But did he give you any money, the brigand? He did, granny, he did. My dear, luck has come to us all of a heap. We've only to open our hand and take it. I waked up Safran. Safran, I said, take off my boots. Safran pulled off my boots. Come, Safran, congratulate me now, give me a kiss. I am going to get married, my lad. I am going to get married. You can get jolly drunk tomorrow. You can have a spree. My dear soul, your master is getting married. My heart was full of jokes and laughter. I was beginning to drop off to sleep, but something made me get up again. I sat and thought, tomorrow is the 1st of April, a bright and playful day. What should I do? And I thought of something. Why, gentlemen, I got out of bed, lighted a candle, and sat down to the writing table just as I was. I was in a fever of excitement, quite carried away, you know, gentlemen, what it is when a man is quite carried away. I wallowed joyfully in the mud, my dear friends. You see what I am like. They take something from you, and you give them something else as well and say, take that too. They strike you on the cheek, and in your joy you offer them your whole back. Then they try to lure you like a dog with a bun, and you embrace them with your foolish paws and fall to kissing them with all your heart and soul. Why, see what I am doing now, gentlemen. You are laughing and whispering, I see it. After I have told you all my story, you will begin to turn me into ridicule. You will begin to attack me, but yet I go on talking and talking and talking. And who tells me to? Who drives me to do it? Who is standing behind my back whispering to me, speak, speak, and tell them? And yet I do talk, I go on telling you, I try to please you as though you were my brothers, all my dearest friends. Etch. The laughter which had sprung up by degrees on all sides completely drowned at last the voice of the speaker, who really seemed worked up into a sort of ecstasy. He paused, for several minutes his eyes strayed about the company, then suddenly, as though carried away by a whirlwind, he waved his hand, burst out laughing himself, as though he really found his position amusing, and fell to telling his story again. I scarcely slept all night, gentlemen. I was scribbling all night. You see, I thought of a trick. Etch, gentlemen, the very thought of it makes me ashamed. It wouldn't have been so bad if it all had been done at night. I might have been drunk, blundered, been silly, and talked nonsense, but not a bit of it. I woke up in the morning as soon as it was light. I hadn't slept more than an hour or two, and was in the same mind. I dressed, I washed, I curled and pomaded my hair, put on my new dress coat, and went straight off to spend the holiday with Fyodor Nikolaich, and I kept the joke I had written in my hat. He met me again with open arms, and invited me again to his fatherly waistcoat. But I assumed an air of dignity. I had the joke I thought of the night before in my mind. I drew a step back. No, Fyodor Nikolaich, but will you please read this letter? And I gave it him together with my daily report. And do you know what was in it? Why, for such and such reasons, the aforesaid Osip Mihalich asks to be discharged. And under my petition, I sign my full rank. Just think what a notion. Good Lord, it was the cleverest thing I could think of. As today was the 1st of April, I was pretending, for the sake of a joke, that my resentment was not over, that I had changed my mind in the night and was grumpy, and more offended than ever, as though to say, my dear benefactor, I don't want to know you nor your daughter either. I put the money in my pocket yesterday, so I am secure, so here's my petition for a transfer to be discharged. I don't care to serve under such a chief as Fyodor Nikolaich. I want to go into a different office, and then maybe I'll inform. I pretended to be a regular scoundrel. I wanted to frighten them. And a nice way of frightening them, wasn't it? A pretty thing, gentlemen, wasn't it? You see, my heart had grown tender towards them since the day before, so I thought I would have a little joke at the family. I would tease the fatherly heart of Fyodor Nikolaich. As soon as he took my letter and opened it, I saw his whole countenance change. What's the meaning of this, Osip Mihalich? And like a little fool, I said, the 1st of April. Many happy returns of the day, Fyodor Nikolaich. Just like a silly schoolboy who hides behind his grandmother's armchair and then shouts oof into her ear suddenly at the top of his voice, meaning to frighten her. Yes. Yes, I feel quite ashamed to talk about it, gentlemen. No, I won't tell you. Nonsense. What happened then? Nonsense, nonsense. Tell us. Yes, do, rose on all sides. There was an outcry and a hullabaloo, my dear friends. Such exclamations of surprise. And you mischievous fellow, you naughty man. And what a fright I had given them, and all so sweet that I felt ashamed, and wondered how such a holy place could be profaned by a sinner like me. Well, my dear boy, piped the mamma, you gave me such a fright that my legs are all of a tremble still. I can hardly stand on my feet. I ran to Masha as though I were crazy. Mashenka, I said, what will become of us? See how your friend has turned out, and I was unjust to you, my dear boy. You must forgive an old woman like me, I was taken in. Well, I thought, when he got home last night, he got home late. He began thinking, and perhaps he fancied that we sent for him on purpose, yesterday, that we wanted to get hold of him. I turned cold at the thought. Give over, Mashenka. Don't go on winking at me. Osip Mihalich isn't a stranger. I am your mother, I am not likely to say any harm. Thank God, I am not 20, but turned 45. Well, gentlemen, I almost flopped at her feet on the spot. Again there were tears, again there were kisses. Jokes began. Fedosy Nikolaich, too, thought he would make April fools of us. He told us the fiery bird had flown up with a letter in her diamond beak. He tried to take us in too, didn't we laugh? Weren't we touched? Phoo. I feel ashamed to talk about it. Well, my good friends, the end is not far off now. One day passed, 2, 3 a week. I was regularly engaged to her. I should think so. The wedding rings were ordered, the day was fixed, only they did not want to make it public for a time. They wanted to wait for the inspector's visit to be over. I was all impatience, for the inspector's arrival. My happiness depended upon him. I was in a hurry to get his visit over. And in the excitement and rejoicing, Fedosy Nikolaich threw all the work upon me. Writing up the accounts, making up the reports, checking the books, balancing the totals. I found things in terrible disorder. Everything had been neglected. There were muddles and irregularities everywhere. Well, I thought, I must do my best for my father-in-law. And he was ailing all the time. He was taken ill, it appears. He seemed to get worse day by day. And indeed, I grew as thin as a rake myself. I was afraid I would break down. However, I finished the work grandly. I got things straight for him in time. Suddenly, they sent a messenger for me. I ran headlong. What could it be? I saw my Fedosy Nikolaich, his head bandaged up in a vinegar compress, frowning, sighing, and moaning. My dear boy, my son, he said, if I die, to whom shall I leave you, my darlings? His wife trailed in with all his children. Mashenka was in tears, and I blubbered too. Oh no, he said. God will be merciful, he will not visit my transgressions on you. Then he dismissed them all, told me to shut the door after them, and we were left alone, tête-à-tête. I have a favor to ask of you. What favor? Well, my dear boy, there is no rest for me even on my deathbed. I am in want. How so? I positively flushed crimson. I could hardly speak. Why, I had to pay some of my own money into the treasury. I grudge nothing for the public weal, my boy. I don't grudge my life. Don't you imagine any ill. I am sad to think that slanderers have blackened my name to you. You were mistaken, my hair has gone white from grief. The inspector is coming down upon us, and Matveyev is 7,000 rubles short, and I shall have to answer for it. Who else? It will be visited upon me, my boy. Where were my eyes? And how can we get it from Matveyev? He has had trouble enough already. Why should I bring the poor fellow to ruin? Holy saints, I thought, what a just man. What a heart. And I don't want to take my daughter's money, which has been set aside for her dowry. That sum is sacred. I have money of my own, it's true, but I have lent it all to friends. How is one to collect it all in a minute? I simply fell on my knees before him. My benefactor? I cried, I've wronged you, I have injured you, it was slanderers who wrote against you, don't break my heart, take back your money. He looked at me, and there were tears in his eyes. That was just what I expected from you, my son. Get up. I forgave you at the time, for the sake of my daughters, tears now, my heart forgives you freely. You have healed my wounds. I bless you for all time. Well, when he blessed me, gentlemen, I scurried home as soon as I could. I got the money. Here, father, here's the money. I've only spent 50 rubles. Well, that's all right, he said. But now every trifle may count. The time is short. Write a report dated some days ago that you were short of money and had taken 50 rubles on account. I'll tell the authorities you had it in advance. Well, gentlemen, what do you think? I did write that report too. Well, what then? What happened? How did it end? As soon as I had written the report, gentlemen, this is how it ended. The next day, in the early morning, an envelope with a government seal arrived. I looked at it, and what had I got? The sack. That is, instructions to hand over my work, to deliver the accounts and to go about my business. How so? That's just what I cried at the top of my voice. How so? Gentlemen, there was a ringing in my ears. I thought there was no special reason for it, but no, the inspector had arrived in the town. My heart sank. It's not for nothing, I thought. And just as I rushed off to Fedosy Nikolaich. How is this? I said. What do you mean? He said. Why, I am dismissed. I dismissed. How? Why, look at this. Well, what of it? Why, but I didn't ask for it. Yes, you did. You sent in your papers on the 1st of April. I had never taken that letter back. Fedosy Nikolaich. I can't believe my ears, I can't believe my eyes. Is this you? It is me. Why? My God. I am sorry, sir. I am very sorry that you made up your mind to retire from the service so early. A young man ought to be in the service, and you've begun to be a little light-headed of late. And as for your character, set your mind at rest. I'll see to that. Your behavior has always been so exemplary. But that was a little joke, Fedosy Nikolaich. I didn't mean it. I just gave you the letter for your fatherly. That's all. That's all. A queer joke, sir. Does one jest with documents like that? Why, you are sometimes sent to Siberia for such jokes. Now, goodbye. I am busy. We have the inspector hear the duties of the service before everything. You can kick up your heels, but we have to sit here at work. But I'll get you a character. Oh, another thing. I've just bought a house from Matveev. We are moving in a day or two. So I expect I shall not have the pleasure of seeing you at our new residence. Bon voyage. I ran home. We are lost, Granny. She wailed, poor dear, and then I saw the page from Fedosy Nikolaich's running up with a note and a bird cage, and in the cage there was a starling. In the fullness of my heart, I had given her the starling. And in the note there were the words, April 1st and nothing more. What do you think of that, gentlemen? What happened then? What happened then? What then? I met Fedosy Nikolaich once. I meant to tell him to his face he was a scoundrel. Well, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to it, gentlemen. A little hero. A story. At that time I was nearly 11. I had been sent in July to spend the holiday in a village near Moscow with a relation of mine called T, whose house was full of guests, 50 or perhaps more. I don't remember, I didn't count. The house was full of noise and gaiety. It seemed as though it were a continual holiday, which would never end. It seemed as though our host had taken a vow to squander all his vast fortune as rapidly as possible. And he did indeed succeed, not long ago, in justifying this surmise, that is, in making a clean sweep of it all to the last stick. Fresh visitors used to drive up every minute. Moscow was close by in sight, so that those who drove away only made room for others, and the everlasting holiday went on its course. Festivities succeeded one another, and there was no end in sight to the entertainments. There were riding parties about the environs, excursions to the forest or the river, picnics, dinners in the open air. Suppers on the great terrace of the house, bordered with 3 rows of gorgeous flowers that flooded with their fragrance the fresh night air, and illuminated the brilliant lights which made our ladies, who were almost every one of them pretty at all times, seem still more charming, with their faces excited by the impressions of the day, with their sparkling eyes, with their interchange of sprightly conversation, their peals of ringing laughter, dancing, music, singing. If the sky were overcast tableaux vivants, charades, proverbs were arranged, private theatricals were got up. There were good talkers, storytellers, wits. Certain persons were prominent in the foreground. Of course, backbiting and slander ran their course, as without them the world could not get on, and millions of persons would perish of boredom, like flies. But as I was at that time, 11, I was absorbed by very different interests, and either failed to observe these people, or if I noticed anything, did not see it all. It was only afterwards that some things came back to my mind. My childish eyes could only see the brilliant side of the picture, and the general animation, splendor, and bustle all that, seen and heard for the first time, made such an impression upon me that for the first few days, I was completely bewildered and my little head was in a whirl. I keep speaking of my age, and of course I was a child, nothing more than a child. Many of these lovely ladies petted me without dreaming of considering my age. But strange to say, a sensation which I did not myself understand already had possession of me. Something was already whispering in my heart, of which till then it had had no knowledge, no conception, and for some reason it began all at once to burn and throb, and often my face glowed with a sudden flush. At times I felt as it were abashed, and even resentful of the various privileges of my childish years. At other times a sort of wonder overwhelmed me, and I would go off into some corner where I could sit unseen, as though to take breath and remember something which it seemed to me I had remembered perfectly till then, and now had suddenly forgotten, something without which I could not show myself anywhere, and could not exist at all. At last it seemed to me as though I were hiding something from everyone. But nothing would have induced me to speak of it to anyone, because, small boy that I was ready to weep with shame. Soon in the midst of the vortex around me I was conscious of a certain loneliness. There were other children, but all were either much older or younger than I. Besides, I was in no mood for them. Of course, nothing would have happened to me if I had not been in an exceptional position. In the eyes of those charming ladies, I was still the little unformed creature whom they at once liked to pet, and with whom they could play as though he were a little doll. One of them particularly, a fascinating, fair woman, with very thick, luxuriant hair, such as I had never seen before and probably shall never see again, seemed to have taken a vow never to leave me in peace. I was confused, while she was amused by the laughter which she continually provoked from all around us by her wild, giddy pranks with me, and this apparently gave her immense enjoyment. At school among her schoolfellows, she was probably nicknamed the Tease. She was wonderfully good-looking, and there was something in her beauty which drew one's eyes from the first moment. And certainly she had nothing in common with the ordinary modest little fair girls, white as down and soft as white mice or pastors' daughters. She was not very tall and was rather plump, but had soft, delicate, exquisitely cut features. There was something quick as lightning in her face, and indeed she was like fire all over, light, swift, alive. Her big open eyes seemed to flash sparks. They glittered like diamonds, and I would never exchange such blue sparkling eyes for any black ones, were they blacker than any Andalusian orb. And indeed, my blonde was fully a match for the famous brunette, whose praises were sung by a great and well-known poet, who, in a superb poem, vowed by all Castile that he was ready to break his bones to be permitted only to touch the mantle of his divinity with the tip of his finger. Add to that my charmer was the merriest in the world, the wildest giggler, playful as a child, although she had been married for the last 5 years. There was a continual laugh upon her lips, fresh as the morning rose that, with the first ray of sunshine, opens its fragrant crimson bud with the cool dewdrops still hanging heavy upon it. I remember that the day after my arrival, private theatricals were being got up. The drawing-room was, as they say, packed to overflowing. There was not a seat empty, and as I was somehow late I had to enjoy the performance standing. But the amusing play attracted me to move forwarder and forwarder, and unconsciously I made my way to the first row, where I stood at last leaning my elbows on the back of an armchair, in which a lady was sitting. It was my blonde divinity, but we had not yet made acquaintance. And I gazed, as it happened, at her marvelous, fascinating shoulders, plump and white as milk, though it did not matter to me in the least whether I stared at a woman's exquisite shoulders or at the cap with flaming ribbons that covered the gray locks of a venerable lady in the front row. Near my blonde divinity sat a spinster lady not in her first youth, one of those who, as I chanced to observe later, always take refuge in the immediate neighborhood of young and pretty women, selecting such as are not fond of cold-shouldering young men. But that is not the point. Only this lady, noting my fixed gaze, bent down to her neighbor and with a simper whispered something in her ear. The blonde lady turned at once, and I remember that her glowing eyes so flashed upon me in the half-dark, that, not prepared to meet them, I started as though I were scalded. The beauty smiled. "Do you like what they are acting?" she asked, looking into my face with a shy and mocking expression. "Yes," I answered, still gazing at her with a sort of wonder that evidently pleased her. "But why are you standing? You'll get tired. Can't you find a seat?" "That's just it, I can't," I answered, more occupied with my grievance than with the beauty's sparkling eyes, and rejoicing in earnest at having found a kind heart to whom I could confide my troubles. "I have looked everywhere, but all the chairs are taken," I added, as though complaining to her that all the chairs were taken. "Come here," she said briskly, quick to act on every decision, and indeed on every mad idea that flashed on her giddy brain. "Come here and sit on my knee." "On your knee," I repeated, taken aback. I have mentioned already that I had begun to resent the privileges of childhood, and to be ashamed of them in earnest. This lady, as though in derision, had gone ever so much further than the others. Moreover, I had always been a shy and bashful boy, and of late had begun to be particularly shy with women. "Why, yes, on my knee." "Why don't you want to sit on my knee?" she persisted, beginning to laugh more and more, so that at last she was simply giggling, goodness knows at what, perhaps at her freak, or perhaps at my confusion. But that was just what she wanted. I flushed, and in my confusion looked round trying to find where to escape. But seeing my intention, she managed to catch hold of my hand to prevent me from going away, and pulling it towards her, suddenly, quite unexpectedly, to my intense astonishment, squeezed it in her mischievous warm fingers, and began to pinch my fingers till they hurt so much that I had to do my very utmost not to cry out, and in my effort to control myself made the most absurd grimaces. I was, besides, moved to the greatest amazement, perplexity, and even horror, at the discovery that there were ladies so absurd and spiteful as to talk nonsense to boys, and even pinch their fingers, for no earthly reason and before everybody. Probably my unhappy face reflected my bewilderment, for the mischievous creature laughed in my face as though she were crazy, and meantime she was pinching my fingers more and more vigorously. She was highly delighted in playing such a mischievous prank and completely mystifying and embarrassing a poor boy. My position was desperate. In the first place, I was hot with shame, because almost everyone near had turned round to look at us, some in wonder, others with laughter, grasping at once that the beauty was up to some mischief. I dreadfully wanted to scream, too, for she was wringing my fingers with positive fury just because I didn't scream. While I, like a Spartan, made up my mind to endure the agony, afraid by crying out of causing a general fuss, which was more than I could face. In utter despair, I began at last struggling with her, trying with all my might to pull away my hand, but my persecutor was much stronger than I was. At last I could bear it no longer, and uttered a shriek that was all she was waiting for. Instantly she let me go, and turned away as though nothing had happened, as though it was not she who had played the trick but someone else, exactly like some schoolboy who, as soon as the master's back is turned, plays some trick on someone near him, pinches some small weak boy, gives him a flip, a kick, or a nudge with his elbows, and instantly turns again, buries himself in his book and begins repeating his lesson, and so makes a fool of the infuriated teacher who flies down like a hawk at the noise. But luckily for me, the general attention was distracted at the moment by the masterly acting of our host, who was playing the chief part in the performance, some comedy of scribes. Every one began to applaud. Under cover of the noise, I stole away and hurried to the furthest end of the room, from which, concealed behind a column, I looked with horror towards the place where the treacherous beauty was sitting. She was still laughing, holding her handkerchief to her lips. And for a long time she was continually turning round, looking for me in every direction, probably regretting that our silly tussle was so soon over, and hatching some other trick to play on me. That was the beginning of our acquaintance, and from that evening she would never let me alone. She persecuted me without consideration or conscience. She became my tyrant and tormentor. The whole absurdity of her jokes with me lay in the fact that she pretended to be head over ears in love with me, and teased me before everyone. Of course, for a wild creature, as I was, all this was so tiresome and vexatious that it almost reduced me to tears, and I was sometimes put in such a difficult position that I was on the point of fighting with my treacherous admirer. My naive confusion, my desperate distress, seemed to egg her on to persecute me more. She knew no mercy, while I did not know how to get away from her. The laughter which always accompanied us, and which she knew so well how to excite, roused her to fresh pranks. But at last, people began to think that she went a little too far in her jests. And indeed, as I remember now, she did take outrageous liberties with a child such as I was. But that was her character. She was a spoilt child in every respect. I heard afterwards that her husband, a very short, very fat, and very red-faced man, very rich and apparently very much occupied with business, spoilt her more than anyone. Always busy and flying round, he could not stay 2 hours in one place. Every day he drove into Moscow, sometimes twice in the day, and always, as he declared himself, on business. It would be hard to find a livelier and more good-natured face than his facetious, but always well-bred countenance. He not only loved his wife to the point of weakness, softness, he simply worshipped her like an idol. He did not restrain her in anything. She had masses of friends, male and female. In the first place, almost everybody liked her. And secondly, the feather-headed creature was not herself over-particular in the choice of her friends, though there was a much more serious foundation to her character than might be supposed from what I have just said about her. But of all her friends, she liked best of all one young lady, a distant relation, who was also of our party now. There existed between them a tender and subtle affection, one of those attachments which sometimes spring up at the meeting of two dispositions often the very opposite of each other, of which one is deeper, purer, and more austere, while the other, with lofty humility and generous self-criticism, lovingly gives way to the other, conscious of the friend's superiority and cherishing the friendship as a happiness. Then begins that tender and noble subtlety in the relations of such characters, love and infinite indulgence on the one side, on the other love and respect approaching awe, approaching anxiety as to the impression made on the friend so highly prized, and an eager, jealous desire to get closer and closer to that friend's heart in every step in life. These two friends were of the same age, but there was an immense difference between them in everything in looks, to begin with. Madame M. was also very handsome, but there was something special in her beauty that strikingly distinguished her from the crowd of pretty women. There was something in her face that at once drew the affection of all to her, or rather, which aroused a generous and lofty feeling of kindliness in everyone who met her. There are such happy faces. At her side everyone grew as it were better, freer, more cordial. And yet her big mournful eyes, full of fire and vigor, had a timid and anxious look, as though every minute dreading something antagonistic and menacing, and this strange timidity at times cast so mournful a shade over her mild, gentle features, which recalled the serene faces of Italian Madonnas, that looking at her one soon became oneself sad, as though for some trouble of one's own. The pale, thin face, in which, through the irreproachable beauty of the pure, regular lines and the mournful severity of some mute hidden grief, there often flitted the clear looks of early childhood, telling of trustful years and perhaps simple-hearted happiness in the recent past. The gentle but diffident, hesitating smile, all aroused such unaccountable sympathy for her that every heart was unconsciously stirred with a sweet and warm anxiety that powerfully interceded on her behalf, even at a distance, and made even strangers feel akin to her. But the lovely creature seemed silent and reserved, though no one could have been more attentive and loving if anyone needed sympathy. There are women who are like sisters of mercy in life. Nothing can be hidden from them, nothing, at least, that is a sore or wound of the heart. Anyone who is suffering may go boldly and hopefully to them without fear of being a burden. For few men know the infinite patience of love, compassion, and forgiveness that may be found in some women's hearts. Perfect treasures of sympathy, consolation, and hope are laid up in these pure hearts, so often full of suffering of their own for a heart, which loves much grieves much though their wounds are carefully hidden from the curious eye. For deep sadness is most often mute and concealed. They are not dismayed by the depth of the wound, nor by its foulness and its stench. Anyone who comes to them is deserving of help. They are, as it were, born for heroism. MME. M. was tall, supple, and graceful, but rather thin. All her movements seemed somehow irregular, at times slow, smooth, and even dignified, at times childishly hasty. And yet, at the same time, there was a sort of timid humility in her gestures, something tremulous and defenseless, though it neither desired nor asked for protection. I have mentioned already that the outrageous teasing of the treacherous fair lady abashed me, flabbergasted me, and wounded me to the quick. But there was for that another secret, strange, and foolish reason, which I concealed, at which I shuddered as at a skeleton. At the very thought of it, brooding, utterly alone and overwhelmed, in some dark, mysterious corner to which the inquisitorial mocking eye of the blue-eyed rogue could not penetrate, I almost gasped with confusion, shame, and fear. In short, I was in love. That perhaps is nonsense, that could hardly have been. But why was it, of all the faces surrounding me, only her face caught my attention? Why was it that it was only she whom I cared to follow with my eyes, though I certainly had no inclination in those days to watch ladies and seek their acquaintance? This happened most frequently on the evenings when we were all kept indoors by bad weather. And when, lonely, hiding in some corner of the big drawing room, I stared about me aimlessly, unable to find anything to do, for except my teasing ladies, few people ever addressed me, and I was insufferably bored on such evenings. Then I stared at the people round me, listened to the conversation, of which I often did not understand one word, and at that time the mild eyes, the gentle smile and lovely face of Mme. M, for she was the object of my passion, for some reason caught my fascinated attention, and the strange, vague, but unutterably sweet impression remained with me. Often for hours together I could not tear myself away from her. I studied every gesture, every movement she made, listened to every vibration of her rich, silvery, but rather muffled voice. But strange to say, as the result of all my observations, I felt, mixed with a sweet and timid impression, a feeling of intense curiosity. It seemed as though I were on the verge of some mystery. Nothing distressed me so much as being mocked at in the presence of Mme. M. This mockery and humorous persecution, as I thought, humiliated me. And when there was a general burst of laughter at my expense, in which Mme. M. sometimes could not help joining, in despair, beside myself with misery, I used to tear myself from my tormentor and run away upstairs, where I remained in solitude the rest of the day, not daring to show my face in the drawing room. I did not yet, however, understand my shame nor my agitation. The whole process went on in me unconsciously. I had hardly said 2 words to Mme. M, and indeed I should not have dared to. But one evening, after an unbearable day, I turned back from an expedition with the rest of the company. I was horribly tired and made my way home across the garden. On a seat in a secluded avenue, I saw Mme. M. She was sitting quite alone, as though she had purposely chosen this solitary spot. Her head was drooping, and she was mechanically twisting her handkerchief. She was so lost in thought that she did not hear me till I reached her. Noticing me, she got up quickly from her seat, turned round, and I saw her hurriedly wipe her eyes with her handkerchief. She was crying. Drying her eyes, she smiled to me and walked back with me to the house. I don't remember what we talked about, but she frequently sent me off on one pretext or another to pick a flower or to see who was riding in the next avenue. And when I walked away from her, she at once put her handkerchief to her eyes again and wiped away rebellious tears, which would persist in rising again and again from her heart and dropping from her poor eyes. I realized that I was very much in her way when she sent me off so often, and indeed, she saw herself that I noticed it all, but yet could not control herself, and that made my heart ache more and more for her. I raged at myself at that moment and was almost in despair, cursed myself for my awkwardness and lack of resource, and at the same time did not know how to leave her tactfully, without betraying that I had noticed her distress, but walked beside her in mournful bewilderment, almost in alarm, utterly at a loss, and unable to find a single word to keep up our scanty conversation. This meeting made such an impression on me that I stealthily watched Mme. M. the whole evening with eager curiosity, and never took my eyes off her. but it happened that she twice caught me unawares watching her, and on the second occasion, noticing me, she gave me a smile. It was the only time she smiled that evening. The look of sadness had not left her face, which was now very pale. She spent the whole evening talking to an ill-natured and quarrelsome old lady, whom nobody liked owing to her spying and backbiting habits, but of whom everyone was afraid, and consequently everyone felt obliged to be polite to her. At 10 o'clock MME. M's husband arrived. Till that moment I watched her very attentively, never taking my eyes off her mournful face. Now at the unexpected entrance of her husband I saw her start, and her pale face turned suddenly as white as a handkerchief. It was so noticeable that other people observed it. I overheard a fragmentary conversation from which I guessed that MME. M was not quite happy. They said her husband was as jealous as an Arab, not from love but from vanity. He was before all things a European, a modern man, who sampled the newest ideas and prided himself upon them. In appearance he was a tall, dark-haired, particularly thick-set man, with European whiskers, with a self-satisfied, red face, with teeth white as sugar, and with an irreproachably gentlemanly deportment. He was called a clever man. Such is the name given in certain circles to a peculiar species of mankind which grows fat at other people's expense, which does absolutely nothing and has no desire to do anything, and whose heart has turned into a lump of fat from everlasting slothfulness and idleness. You continually hear from such men that there is nothing they can do owing to certain very complicated and hostile circumstances, which thwart their genius, and that it was sad to see the waste of their talents. This is a fine phrase of theirs, their mot d'ordre, their watchword, a phrase which these well-fed, fat friends of ours bring out at every minute, so that it has long ago bored us as an errant tardiffism, an empty form of words. Some, however, of these amusing creatures, who cannot succeed in finding anything to do though, indeed, they never seek it try to make every one believe that they have not a lump of fat for a heart, but on the contrary, something very deep, though what precisely the greatest surgeon would hardly venture to decide from civility, of course. These gentlemen make their way in the world through the fact that all their instincts are bent in the direction of coarse sneering, short-sighted censure, and immense conceit. Since they have nothing else to do but note and emphasize the mistakes and weaknesses of others, and as they have precisely as much good feeling as an oyster, it is not difficult for them, with such powers of self-preservation, to get on with people fairly successfully. They pride themselves extremely upon that. They are, for instance, as good as persuaded that almost the whole world owes them something, that it is theirs, like an oyster which they keep in reserve, that all are fools except themselves, that every one is like an orange or a sponge, which they will squeeze as soon as they want the juice, that they are the masters everywhere, and that all this acceptable state of affairs is solely due to the fact that they are people of so much intellect and character. In their measureless conceit, they do not admit any defects in themselves. They are like that species of practical rogues, innate Tartuffes and Falstaffs, who are such thorough rogues that at last they have come to believe that that is as it should be, that is, that they should spend their lives in knavishness. They have so often assured everyone that they are honest men, that they have come to believe that they are honest men, and that their roguery is honesty. They are never capable of inner judgment before their conscience, of generous self-criticism. For some things they are too fat. Their own priceless personality, their Baal and Moloch, their magnificent ego is always in their foreground everywhere. All nature, the whole world for them, is no more than a splendid mirror created for the little god to admire himself continually in it, and to see no one and nothing behind himself. So it is not strange that he sees everything in the world in such a hideous light. He has a phrase in readiness for everything, and the acme of ingenuity on his part the most fashionable phrase. It is just these people, indeed, who help to make the fashion, proclaiming at every crossroad an idea in which they scent success. A fine nose is just what they have for sniffing a fashionable phrase and making it their own before other people get hold of it, so that it seems to have originated with them. They have a particular store of phrases for proclaiming their profound sympathy for humanity, for defining what is the most correct and rational form of philanthropy, and continually attacking romanticism, in other words, everything fine and true, each atom of which is more precious than all their mollusk tribe. But they are too coarse to recognize the truth in an indirect, roundabout, and unfinished form, and they reject everything that is immature, still fermenting and unstable. The well-nourished man has spent all his life in merrymaking, with everything provided, has done nothing himself, and does not know how hard every sort of work is, and so woe betide you if you jar upon his fat feelings by any sort of roughness. He'll never forgive you for that, he will always remember it and will gladly avenge it. The long and short of it is that my hero is neither more nor less than a gigantic, incredibly swollen bag, full of sentences, fashionable phrases, and labels of all sorts and kinds. M, however, had a speciality and was a very remarkable man. He was a wit, good talker, and storyteller, and there was always a circle round him in every drawing room. That evening, he was particularly successful in making an impression. He took possession of the conversation. He was in his best form, gay, pleased at something, and he compelled the attention of all but M. M looked all the time as though she were ill. Her face was so sad that I fancied every minute that tears would begin quivering on her long eyelashes. All this, as I have said, impressed me extremely and made me wonder. I went away with a feeling of strange curiosity and dreamed all night of M, though till then I had rarely had dreams. Next day, early in the morning, I was summoned to a rehearsal of some tableaux vivants in which I had to take part. The tableaux vivants, theatricals, and afterwards a dance were all fixed for the same evening, 5 days later the birthday of our host's younger daughter. To this entertainment, which was almost improvised, another 100 guests were invited from Moscow and from surrounding villas, so that there was a great deal of fuss, bustle, and commotion. The rehearsal, or rather review of the costumes, was fixed so early in the morning because our manager, a well-known artist, a friend of our host's, who had consented through affection for him to undertake the arrangement of the tableau and the training of us for them, was in haste now to get to Moscow to purchase properties and to make final preparations for the fete, as there was no time to lose. I took part in one tableau with M. It was a scene from medieval life, and was called The Lady of the Castle and Her Page. I felt unutterably confused on meeting M. At the rehearsal, I kept feeling that she would at once read in my eyes all the reflections, the doubts, the surmises that had arisen in my mind since the previous day. I fancied, too, that I was, as it were, to blame in regard to her, for having come upon her tears the day before and hindered her grieving, so that she could hardly help looking at me askance, as an unpleasant witness and unforgiven sharer of her secret. But thank goodness, it went off without any great trouble. I was simply not noticed. I think she had no thoughts to spare for me or for the rehearsal. She was absent-minded, sad, and gloomily thoughtful. It was evident that she was worried by some great anxiety. As soon as my part was over, I ran away to change my clothes, and 10 minutes later came out on the veranda into the garden. Almost at the same time, M came out by another door, and immediately afterwards coming towards us appeared her self-satisfied husband, who was returning from the garden, after just escorting into it quite a crowd of ladies and there handing them over to a competent cavalier servant. The meeting of the husband and wife was evidently unexpected. I don't know why, grew suddenly confused, and a faint trace of vexation was betrayed in her impatient movement. The husband, who had been carelessly whistling an air, and with an air of profundity stroking his whiskers, now, on meeting his wife, frowned and scrutinized her, as I remember now, with a markedly inquisitorial stare. "You are going into the garden?" he asked, noticing the parasol and book in her hand. "No, into the copse," she said with a slight flush. "Alone?" "With him," said pointing to me. "I always go a walk alone in the morning," she added, speaking in an uncertain, hesitating voice, as people do when they tell their first lie. And I have just taken the whole party there. They have all met there together in the flower arbor to see N. Off. He is going away, you know. Something has gone wrong in Odessa. Your cousin, he meant the fair beauty, is laughing and crying at the same time. There is no making her out. She says, though, that you are angry with N. about something and so wouldn't go and see him off. Nonsense, of course. She's laughing, said MME. M, coming down the veranda steps. So this is your daily cavalier servant, added M. M, with a wry smile, turning his lorgnette upon me. Page, I cried, angered by the lorgnette and the jeer. And laughing straight in his face, I jumped down the 3 steps of the veranda at one bound. A pleasant walk, muttered M. And went on his way. Of course, I immediately joined MME. M, as soon as she indicated me to her husband, and looked as though she had invited me to do so an hour before, and as though I had been accompanying her on her walks every morning for the last month. But I could not make out why she was so confused, so embarrassed, and what was in her mind when she brought herself to have recourse to her little lie. Why had she not simply said that she was going alone? I did not know how to look at her, but overwhelmed with wonder I began by degrees very naively peeping into her face. But just as an hour before at the rehearsal, she did not notice either my looks or my mute question. The same anxiety, only more intense and more distinct, was apparent in her face, in her agitation, in her walk. She was in haste, and walked more and more quickly, and kept looking uneasily down every avenue, down every path in the wood that led in the direction of the garden. And I, too, was expecting something. Suddenly, there was the sound of horses' hoofs behind us. It was the whole party of ladies and gentlemen on horseback escorting N, the gentleman who was so suddenly deserting us. Among the ladies was my fair tormentor, of whom M. had told us that she was in tears. But characteristically, she was laughing like a child, and was galloping briskly on a splendid bay horse. On reaching us, N. took off his hat but did not stop, nor say one word to MME. Soon all the cavalcade disappeared from our sight. I glanced at MME. And almost cried out in wonder. She was standing as white as a handkerchief, and big tears were gushing from her eyes. By chance our eyes met. MME. Suddenly flushed and turned away for an instant, and a distinct look of uneasiness and vexation flitted across her face. I was in the way, worse even than last time, that was clearer than day, but how was I to get away? And as though guessing my difficulty, MME. Opened the book which she had in her hand, and coloring and evidently trying not to look at me, she said, as though she had only suddenly realized it. It is the second part. I've made a mistake, please bring me the first. I could not but understand. My part was over, and I could not have been more directly dismissed. I ran off with her book and did not come back. The first part lay undisturbed on the table that morning. But I was not myself. In my heart there was a sort of haunting terror. I did my utmost not to meet MME. But I looked with wild curiosity at the self-satisfied person of M, as though there must be something special about him now. I don't understand what was the meaning of my absurd curiosity. I only remember that I was strangely perplexed by all that I had chanced to see that morning. But the day was only just beginning, and it was fruitful in events for me. Dinner was very early that day. An expedition to a neighboring hamlet to see a village festival that was taking place there had been fixed for the evening, and so it was necessary to be in time to get ready. I had been dreaming for the last 3 days of this excursion, anticipating all sorts of delights. Almost all the company gathered together on the veranda for coffee. I cautiously followed the others and concealed myself behind the 3rd row of chairs. I was attracted by curiosity, and yet I was very anxious not to be seen by MME. But as luck would have it, I was not far from my fair tormentor. Something miraculous and incredible was happening to her that day. She looked twice as handsome. I don't know how and why this happens, but such miracles are by no means rare with women. There was with us at this moment a new guest, a tall, pale-faced young man, the official admirer of our fair beauty, who had just arrived from Moscow as though on purpose to replace N, of whom rumor said that he was desperately in love with the same lady. As for the newly arrived guest, He had for a long time past been on the same terms as Benedick with Beatrice, in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. In short, the fair beauty was in her very best form that day. Her chatter and her jests were so full of grace, so trustfully naive, so innocently careless, she was persuaded of the general enthusiasm with such graceful self-confidence that she really was all the time the center of peculiar adoration. A throng of surprised and admiring listeners was continually round her, and she had never been so fascinating. Every word she uttered was marvelous and seductive, was caught up and handed round in the circle, and not one word, one jest, one sally was lost. I fancy no one had expected from her such taste, such brilliance, such wit. Her best qualities were, as a rule, buried under the most harum-scarum willfulness, the most schoolboyish pranks, almost verging on buffoonery. They were rarely noticed, and when they were hardly believed in, so that now her extraordinary brilliancy was accompanied by an eager whisper of amazement among all. There was, however, one peculiar and rather delicate circumstance, judging at least by the part in it played by M.M.E. M's husband, which contributed to her success. The madcap ventured and I must add to the satisfaction of almost everyone, or, at any rate, to the satisfaction of all the young people to make a furious attack upon him, owing to many causes, probably of great consequence in her eyes. She carried on with him a regular crossfire of witticisms, of mocking and sarcastic sallies, of that most elusive and treacherous kind that, smoothly wrapped up on the surface, hit the mark without giving the victim anything to lay hold of, and exhaust him in fruitless efforts to repel the attack, reducing him to fury and comic despair. I don't know for certain, but I fancy the whole proceeding was not improvised but premeditated. This desperate duel had begun earlier, at dinner. I call it desperate because M. was not quick to surrender. He had to call upon all his presence of mind, all his sharp wit and rare resourcefulness not to be completely covered with ignominy. The conflict was accompanied by the continual and irrepressible laughter of all who witnessed and took part in it. That day was for him very different from the day before. It was noticeable that M several times did her utmost to stop her indiscreet friend, who was certainly trying to depict the jealous husband in the most grotesque and absurd guise, in the guise of a Bluebeard, it must be supposed, judging from all probabilities, from what has remained in my memory, and finally from the part which I myself was destined to play in the affair. I was drawn into it in a most absurd manner, quite unexpectedly. And as ill luck would have it at that moment, I was standing where I could be seen, suspecting no evil and actually forgetting the precautions I had so long practiced. Suddenly I was brought into the foreground, as a sworn foe and natural rival of M, as desperately in love with his wife, of which my persecutress vowed and swore that she had proofs, saying that only that morning she had seen in the copse. But before she had time to finish, I broke in at the most desperate minute. That minute was so diabolically calculated, was so treacherously prepared to lead up to its finale, its ludicrous denouement, and was brought out with such killing humor that a perfect outburst of irrepressible mirth saluted this last sally. And though even at the time I guessed that mine was not the most unpleasant part in the performance, yet I was so confused, so irritated and alarmed that, full of misery and despair, gasping with shame and tears, I dashed through 2 rows of chairs, stepped forward, and addressing my tormentor, cried, in a voice broken with tears and indignation, "Aren't you ashamed? Aloud, before all the ladies, to tell such a wicked lie, like a small child, before all these men? What will they say? A big girl like you. And married." But I could not go on. There was a deafening roar of applause. My outburst created a perfect furore. My naive gesture, my tears, and especially the fact that I seemed to be defending M, all this provoked such fiendish laughter that even now I cannot help laughing at the mere recollection of it. I was overcome with confusion, senseless with horror, and, burning with shame, hiding my face in my hands, rushed away, knocked a tray out of the hands of a footman who was coming in at the door, and flew upstairs to my own room. I pulled out the key, which was on the outside of the door, and locked myself in. I did well, for there was a hue and cry after me. Before a minute had passed, my door was besieged by a mob of the prettiest ladies. I heard their ringing laughter, their incessant chatter, their trilling voices. They were all twittering at once, like swallows. All of them, every one of them, begged and besought me to open the door, if only for a moment, swore that no harm should come to me, only that they wanted to smother me with kisses. But what could be more horrible than this novel threat? I simply burned with shame the other side of the door, hiding my face in the pillows, and did not open, did not even respond. The ladies kept up their knocking for a long time, but I was deaf and obdurate, as only a boy of 11 could be. But what could I do now? Everything was laid bare, everything had been exposed, everything I had so jealously guarded and concealed. Everlasting disgrace and shame had fallen on me. But it is true that I could not myself have said why I was frightened and what I wanted to hide. Yet I was frightened of something and had trembled like a leaf at the thought of that something's being discovered. Only till that minute I had not known what it was, whether it was good or bad, splendid or shameful, praiseworthy or reprehensible. Now in my distress, in the misery that had been forced upon me, I learned that it was absurd and shameful. Instinctively, I felt at the same time that this verdict was false, inhuman, and coarse, but I was crushed, annihilated. Consciousness seemed checked in me and thrown into confusion. I could not stand up against that verdict, nor criticize it properly. I was befogged. I only felt that my heart had been inhumanly and shamelessly wounded, and was brimming over with impotent tears. I was irritated, but I was boiling with indignation and hate such as I had never felt before, for it was the first time in my life that I had known real sorrow, insult, and injury, and it was truly that, without any exaggeration. The first untried, unformed feeling had been so coarsely handled in me, a child. The first fragrant, virginal modesty had been so soon exposed and insulted, and the first, and perhaps very real and aesthetic impression had been so outraged. Of course, there was much my persecutors did not know, and did not divine in my sufferings. One circumstance, which I had not succeeded in analyzing till then, of which I had been as it were afraid, partly entered into it. I went on lying on my bed in despair and misery, hiding my face in my pillow, and I was alternately feverish and shivery. I was tormented by two questions. First, what had the wretched fair beauty seen, and in fact, what could she have seen that morning in the copse between M and me? And secondly, how could I now look M in the face without dying on the spot of shame and despair? An extraordinary noise in the yard roused me at last from the state of semi-consciousness into which I had fallen. I got up and went to the window. The whole yard was packed with carriages, saddle horses, and bustling servants. It seemed that they were all setting off. Some of the gentlemen had already mounted their horses, others were taking their places in the carriages. Then I remembered the expedition to the village fete, and little by little an uneasiness came over me. I began anxiously looking for my pony in the yard, but there was no pony there, so they must have forgotten me. I could not restrain myself, and rushed headlong downstairs, thinking no more of unpleasant meetings or my recent ignominy. Terrible news awaited me. There was neither a horse nor seat in any of the carriages to spare for me. Everything had been arranged, all the seats were taken, and I was forced to give place to others. Overwhelmed by this fresh blow, I stood on the steps and looked mournfully at the long rows of coaches, carriages, and chaises, in which there was not the tiniest corner left for me, and at the smartly dressed ladies, whose horses were restlessly curveting. One of the gentlemen was late. They were only waiting for his arrival to set off. His horse was standing at the door, champing the bit, pawing the earth with his hoofs, and at every moment starting and rearing. Two stable boys were carefully holding him by the bridle, and everyone else apprehensively stood at a respectful distance from him. A most vexatious circumstance had occurred, which prevented my going. In addition to the fact that new visitors had arrived, filling up all the seats, two of the horses had fallen ill, one of them being my pony. But I was not the only person to suffer. It appeared that there was no horse for our new visitor, the pale-faced young man of whom I have spoken already. To get over this difficulty, our host had been obliged to have recourse to the extreme step of offering his fiery, unbroken stallion, adding, to satisfy his conscience, that it was impossible to ride him, and that they had long intended to sell the beast for its vicious character, if only a purchaser could be found. But in spite of his warning, the visitor declared that he was a good horseman, and in any case ready to mount anything rather than not go. Our host said no more, but now I fancied that a sly and ambiguous smile was straying on his lips. He waited for the gentleman who had spoken so well of his own horsemanship, and stood, without mounting his horse, impatiently rubbing his hands and continually glancing towards the door. Some similar feeling seemed shared by the two stable boys, who were holding the stallion, almost breathless with pride at seeing themselves before the whole company in charge of a horse, which might any minute kill a man for no reason whatever. Something akin to their master's sly smile gleamed, too, in their eyes, which were round with expectation, and fixed upon the door from which the bold visitor was to appear. The horse himself, too, behaved as though he were in league with our host and the stable boys. He bore himself proudly and haughtily, as though he felt that he were being watched by several dozen curious eyes, and were glorying in his evil reputation exactly as some incorrigible rogue might glory in his criminal exploits. He seemed to be defying the bold man who would venture to curb his independence. That bold man did at last make his appearance. Conscience-stricken at having kept everyone waiting, hurriedly drawing on his gloves, he came forward without looking at anything, ran down the steps, and only raised his eyes as he stretched out his hand to seize the mane of the waiting horse. But he was at once disconcerted by his frantic rearing and a warning scream from the frightened spectators. The young man stepped back and looked in perplexity at the vicious horse, which was quivering all over, snorting with anger, and rolling his bloodshot eyes ferociously, continually rearing on his hind legs and flinging up his fore legs as though he meant to bolt into the air and carry the two stable boys with him. For a minute the young man stood completely nonplussed. Then, flushing slightly with some embarrassment, he raised his eyes and looked at the frightened ladies. "A very fine horse," he said, as though to himself, "and to my thinking it ought to be a great pleasure to ride him, but do you know, I think I won't go," he concluded, turning to our host with the broad, good-natured smile which so suited his kind and clever face. "Yet I consider you are an excellent horseman, I assure you," answered the owner of the unapproachable horse, delighted, and he warmly and even gratefully pressed the young man's hand. "Just because from the first moment you saw the sort of brute you had to deal with," he added with dignity. "Would you believe me, though I have served 23 years in the Hussars, yet I've had the pleasure of being laid on the ground 3 times, thanks to that beast, that is, as often as I mounted the useless animal. Tancred, my boy, there's no one here fit for you. Your rider, it seems, must be some Ilya Muromets, and he must be sitting quiet now in the village of Kapicharovo, waiting for your teeth to fall out. Come, take him away, he has frightened people enough. It was a waste of time to bring him out," he cried, rubbing his hands complacently. It must be observed that Tancred was no sort of use to his master, and simply ate corn for nothing. Moreover, the old Hussar had lost his reputation for a knowledge of horseflesh, by paying a fabulous sum for the worthless beast, which he had purchased only for his beauty. Yet he was delighted now that Tancred had kept up his reputation, had disposed of another rider, and so had drawn closer on himself fresh, senseless laurels. "So you are not going," cried the blonde beauty, who was particularly anxious that her cavalier servant should be in attendance on this occasion. "Surely you are not frightened?" "Upon my word I am," answered the young man. "Are you in earnest? Why, do you want me to break my neck? Then make haste and get on my horse. Don't be afraid, it is very quiet. We won't delay them, they can change the saddles in a minute. I'll try to take yours. Surely Tancred can't always be so unruly." No sooner said than done. The madcap leaped out of the saddle and was standing before us as she finished the last sentence. "You don't know Tancred, if you think he will allow your wretched side saddle to be put on him. Besides, I would not let you break your neck, it would be a pity," said our host, at that moment of inward gratification affecting, as his habit was, a studied brusqueness and even coarseness of speech which he thought in keeping with a jolly good fellow and an old soldier, and which he imagined to be particularly attractive to the ladies. This was one of his favorite fancies, his favorite whim, with which we were all familiar. "Well, crybaby, wouldn't you like to have a try?" "You wanted so much to go?" said the valiant horsewoman, noticing me and pointing tauntingly at Tancred, because I had been so imprudent as to catch her eye, and she would not let me go without a biting word, that she might not have dismounted from her horse absolutely for nothing. "I expect you are not such a we all know you are a hero, and would be ashamed to be afraid, especially when you will be looked at, you fine page," she added, with a fleeting glance at M, whose carriage was the nearest to the entrance. A rush of hatred and vengeance had flooded my heart, when the fair Amazon had approached us with the intention of mounting Tancred. But I cannot describe what I felt at this unexpected challenge from the madcap. Everything was dark before my eyes when I saw her glance at M. For an instant an idea flashed through my mind. But it was only a moment, less than a moment, like a flash of gunpowder. Perhaps it was the last straw, and I suddenly now was moved to rage as my spirit rose, so that I longed to put all my enemies to utter confusion, and to revenge myself on all of them and before everyone by showing the sort of person I was. Or whether by some miracle, some prompting from medieval history of which I had known nothing till then, sent whirling through my giddy brain images of tournaments, paladins, heroes, lovely ladies, the clash of swords, shouts, and the applause of the crowd, and amidst those shouts the timid cry of a frightened heart, which moves the proud soul more sweetly than victory and fame. I don't know whether all this romantic nonsense was in my head at the time, or whether, more likely, only the first dawning of the inevitable nonsense that was in store for me in the future. Anyway, I felt that my hour had come. My heart leaped and shuddered, and I don't remember how, at one bound, I was down the steps and beside Tancred. "You think I am afraid?" I cried, boldly and proudly, in such a fever that I could hardly see, breathless with excitement and flushing till the tears scalded my cheeks. "Well, you shall see." And clutching at Tancred's mane, I put my foot in the stirrup before they had time to make a movement to stop me. But at that instant Tancred reared, jerked his head, and with a mighty bound forward, wrenched himself out of the hands of the petrified stable boys and dashed off like a hurricane, while everyone cried out in horror. Goodness knows how I got my other leg over the horse while it was in full gallop. I can't imagine, either, how I did not lose hold of the reins. Tancred bore me beyond the trellis gate, turned sharply to the right, and flew along beside the fence regardless of the road. Only at that moment, I heard behind me a shout from 50 voices, and that shout was echoed in my swooning heart with such a feeling of pride and pleasure that I shall never forget that mad moment of my boyhood. All the blood rushed to my head, bewildering me and overpowering my fears. I was beside myself. There certainly was, as I remember it now, something of the knight-errant about the exploit. My knightly exploits, however, were all over in an instant, or it would have gone badly with the knight. And indeed, I do not know how I escaped as it was. I did know how to ride, I had been taught. But my pony was more like a sheep than a riding horse. No doubt I should have been thrown off Tancred if he had had time to throw me. But after galloping 50 paces, he suddenly took fright at a huge stone which lay across the road and bolted back. He turned sharply, galloping at full speed, so that it is a puzzle to me even now that I was not sent spinning out of the saddle and flying like a ball for 20 feet, that I was not dashed to pieces, and that Tancred did not dislocate his leg by such a sudden turn. He rushed back to the gate, tossing his head furiously, bounding from side to side as though drunk with rage, flinging his legs at random in the air, and at every leap trying to shake me off his back as though a tiger had leaped on him and were thrusting its teeth and claws into his back. In another instant I should have flown off. I was falling, but several gentlemen flew to my rescue. 2 of them intercepted the way into the open country. 2 others galloped up, closing in upon Tancred so that their horses' sides almost crushed my legs, and both of them caught him by the bridle. A few seconds later we were back at the steps. They lifted me down from the horse, pale and scarcely breathing. I was shaking like a blade of grass in the wind. It was the same with Tancred, who was standing, his hoofs as it were thrust into the earth and his whole body thrown back, puffing his fiery breath from red and streaming nostrils, twitching and quivering all over, seeming overwhelmed with wounded pride and anger at a child's being so bold with impunity. All around me, I heard cries of bewilderment, surprise, and alarm. At that moment, my straying eyes caught those of MME. M, who looked pale and agitated, and I can never forget that moment. In one instant my face was flooded with color, glowed and burned like fire. I don't know what happened to me, but confused and frightened by my own feelings, I timidly dropped my eyes to the ground. But my glance was noticed, it was caught, it was stolen from me. All eyes turned on MME. M, and finding herself unawares the center of attention, she, too, flushed like a child from some naive and involuntary feeling, and made an unsuccessful effort to cover her confusion by laughing. All this, of course, was very absurd-looking from outside. But at that moment, an extremely naive and unexpected circumstance saved me from being laughed at by everyone and gave a special color to the whole adventure. The lovely persecutor, who was the instigator of the whole escapade, and who till then had been my irreconcilable foe, suddenly rushed up to embrace and kiss me. She had hardly been able to believe her eyes when she saw me dare to accept her challenge, and pick up the gauntlet she had flung at me by glancing at MME. She had almost died of terror and self-reproach when I had flown off on Tancred. Now, when it was all over, and particularly when she caught the glance at MME. My confusion and my sudden flush of color, when the romantic strain in her frivolous little head had given a new secret, unspoken significance to the moment, she was moved to such enthusiasm over my knightliness that, touched, joyful, and proud of me, she rushed up and pressed me to her bosom. She lifted the most naive, stern-looking little face, on which there quivered and gleamed two little crystal tears, and gazing at the crowd that thronged about her said in a grave, earnest voice, such as they had never heard her use before, pointing to me, "Mais c'est très sérieux, messieurs, ne riez pas." She did not notice that all were standing, as though fascinated, admiring her bright enthusiasm. Her swift, unexpected action, her earnest little face, the simple-hearted naivete, the unexpected feeling betrayed by the tears that welled in her invariably laughter-loving eyes, were such a surprise that everyone stood before her as though electrified by her expression, her rapid, fiery words and gestures. It seemed as though no one could take his eyes off her, for fear of missing that rare moment in her enthusiastic face. Even our host flushed crimson as a tulip, and people declared that they heard him confess afterwards that, to his shame, he had been in love for a whole minute with his charming guest. Well, of course, after this I was a knight, a hero. De Lorge. Toggenburg was heard in the crowd. There was a sound of applause. "Hurrah for the rising generation," added the host. "But he is coming with us, he certainly must come with us," said the beauty. "We will find him a place, we must find him a place. He shall sit beside me, on my knee." But no. That's a mistake. She corrected herself, laughing, unable to restrain her mirth at our first encounter. But as she laughed, she stroked my hand tenderly, doing all she could to soften me, that I might not be offended. Of course, several voices chimed in. He must go, he has won his place. The matter was settled in a trice. The same old maid who had brought about my acquaintance with the blonde beauty was at once besieged with entreaties from all the younger people to remain at home and let me have her seat. She was forced to consent, to her intense vexation, with a smile and a stealthy hiss of anger. Her protectress, who was her usual refuge, my former foe and new friend, called to her as she galloped off on her spirited horse, laughing like a child, that she envied her and would have been glad to stay at home herself, for it was just going to rain and we should all get soaked. And she was right in predicting rain. A regular downpour came on within an hour, and the expedition was done for. We had to take shelter for some hours in the huts of the village, and had to return home between 9 and 10 in the evening in the damp mist that followed the rain. I began to be a little feverish. At the minute when I was starting, came up to me and expressed surprise that my neck was uncovered, and that I had nothing on over my jacket. I answered that I had not had time to get my coat. She took out a pin and pinned up the turned-down collar of my shirt, took off her own neck a crimson gauze kerchief, and put it round my neck that I might not get a sore throat. She did this so hurriedly that I had not time even to thank her. But when we got home, I found her in the little drawing room with the blonde beauty and the pale-faced young man who had gained glory for horsemanship that day by refusing to ride Tancred. I went up to thank her and give back the scarf. But now, after all my adventures, I felt somehow ashamed. I wanted to make haste and get upstairs, there at my leisure to reflect and consider. I was brimming over with impressions. As I gave back the kerchief, I blushed up to my ears, as usual. "I bet he would like to keep the kerchief," said the young man, laughing. "One can see that he is sorry to part with your scarf." That's it," the fair lady put in. "What a boy." "Oh," she said, shaking her head with obvious vexation, but she stopped in time at a grave glance from M, who did not want to carry the jest too far. I made haste to get away. "Well, you are a boy," said the madcap, overtaking me in the next room and affectionately taking me by both hands. "Why, you should have simply not returned the kerchief if you wanted so much to have it. You should have said you put it down somewhere, and that would have been the end of it. What a simpleton. Couldn't even do that. What a funny boy." And she tapped me on the chin with her finger, laughing at my having flushed as red as a poppy. "I am your friend now, you know, am I not? Our enmity is over, isn't it? Yes or no?" I laughed and pressed her fingers without a word. "Oh, why are you so pale and shivering? Have you caught a chill?" "Yes, I don't feel well." "Ah, poor fellow. That's the result of overexcitement. Do you know what? You had better go to bed without sitting up for supper, and you will be all right in the morning. Come along." She took me upstairs, and there was no end to the care she lavished on me. Leaving me to undress, she ran downstairs, got me some tea, and brought it up herself when I was in bed. She brought me up a warm quilt as well. I was much impressed and touched by all the care and attention lavished on me, or perhaps I was affected by the whole day, the expedition and feverishness. As I said good night to her, I hugged her warmly, as though she were my dearest and nearest friend, and in my exhausted state, all the emotions of the day came back to me in a rush. I almost shed tears as I nestled to her bosom. She noticed my overwrought condition, and I believe my madcap herself was a little touched. "You are a very good boy," she said, looking at me with gentle eyes. "Please don't be angry with me." "You won't, will you?" In fact, we became the warmest and truest of friends. It was rather early when I woke up, but the sun was already flooding the whole room with brilliant light. I jumped out of bed feeling perfectly well and strong, as though I had had no fever the day before. Indeed, I felt now unutterably joyful. I recalled the previous day and felt that I would have given any happiness if I could at that minute have embraced my new friend, the fair-haired beauty, again, as I had the night before. But it was very early and everyone was still asleep. Hurriedly dressing, I went out into the garden, and from there into the copse. I made my way where the leaves were thickest, where the fragrance of the trees was more resinous, and where the sun peeped in most gaily, rejoicing that it could penetrate the dense darkness of the foliage. It was a lovely morning. Going on further and further, before I was aware of it, I had reached the further end of the copse and came out on the river Moskva. It flowed at the bottom of the hill 200 paces below. On the opposite bank of the river, they were mowing. I watched whole rows of sharp scythes gleam all together in the sunlight at every swing of the mower, and then vanish again like little fiery snakes going into hiding. I watched the cut grass flying on one side in dense, rich swathes and being laid in long, straight lines. I don't know how long I spent in contemplation. At last I was roused from my reverie by hearing a horse snorting and impatiently pawing the ground 20 paces from me, in the track which ran from the high road to the manor house. I don't know whether I heard this horse as soon as the rider rode up and stopped there, or whether the sound had long been in my ears without rousing me from my dreaming. Moved by curiosity, I went into the copse, and before I had gone many steps, I caught the sound of voices speaking rapidly, though in subdued tones. I went up closer, carefully parting the branches of the bushes that edged the path, and at once sprang back in amazement. I caught a glimpse of a familiar white dress, and a soft feminine voice resounded like music in my heart. It was Mme. M. She was standing beside a man on horseback who, stooping down from the saddle, was hurriedly talking to her, and to my amazement I recognized him as N, the young man who had gone away the morning before and over whose departure M. had been so busy. But people had said at the time that he was going far away to somewhere in the south of Russia, and so I was very much surprised at seeing him with us again so early, and alone with Mme. M. She was moved and agitated as I had never seen her before, and tears were glistening on her cheeks. The young man was holding her hand and stooping down to kiss it. I had come upon them at the moment of parting. They seemed to be in haste. At last he took out of his pocket a sealed envelope, gave it to Mme. M put one arm round her, still not dismounting, and gave her a long, fervent kiss. A minute later, he lashed his horse and flew past me like an arrow. Mme. M. looked after him for some moments, then pensively and disconsolately turned homewards. But after going a few steps along the track, she seemed suddenly to recollect herself, hurriedly parted the bushes and walked on through the copse. I followed her, surprised and perplexed by all that I had seen. My heart was beating violently, as though from terror. I was, as it were, benumbed and befogged. My ideas were shattered and turned upside down, but I remember I was, for some reason, very sad. I got glimpses from time to time through the green foliage of her white dress before me. I followed her mechanically, never losing sight of her, though I trembled at the thought that she might notice me. At last she came out on the little path that led to the house. After waiting half a minute I, too, emerged from the bushes. But what was my amazement when I saw lying on the red sand of the path a sealed packet, which I recognized, from the first glance, as the one that had been given to Mme. M. 10 minutes before. I picked it up. On both sides the paper was blank, there was no address on it. The envelope was not large, but it was fat and heavy, as though there were 3 or more sheets of notepaper in it. What was the meaning of this envelope? No doubt it would explain the whole mystery. Perhaps in it there was said all that N. had scarcely hoped to express in their brief, hurried interview. He had not even dismounted. Whether he had been in haste, or whether he had been afraid of being false to himself at the hour of parting, God only knows. I stopped without coming out on the path, threw the envelope in the most conspicuous place on it, and kept my eyes upon it, supposing that Mme. M. would notice the loss and come back and look for it. But after waiting 4 minutes I could stand it no longer. I picked up my find again, put it in my pocket, and set off to overtake Mme. M. I came upon her in the big avenue in the garden. She was walking straight towards the house with a swift and hurried step, though she was lost in thought, and her eyes were on the ground. I did not know what to do. Go up to her, give it her. That would be as good as saying that I knew everything, that I had seen it all. I should betray myself at the first word. And how should I look at her? How would she look at me? I kept expecting that she would discover her loss and return on her tracks. Then I could, unnoticed, have flung the envelope on the path and she would have found it. But no. We were approaching the house, she had already been noticed. As ill luck would have it, everyone had got up very early that day, because, after the unsuccessful expedition of the evening before, they had arranged something new, of which I had heard nothing. All were preparing to set off, and were having breakfast in the veranda. I waited for 10 minutes, that I might not be seen with Mme. M, and making a circuit of the garden, approached the house from the other side a long time after her. She was walking up and down the veranda with her arms folded, looking pale and agitated, and was obviously trying her utmost to suppress the agonizing, despairing misery which could be plainly discerned in her eyes, her walk, her every movement. Sometimes she went down the veranda steps and walked a few paces among the flower beds in the direction of the garden. Her eyes were impatiently, greedily, even incautiously, seeking something on the sand of the path and on the floor of the veranda. There could be no doubt she had discovered her loss and imagined she had dropped the letter somewhere here, near the house. Yes, that must be so, she was convinced of it. Someone noticed that she was pale and agitated, and others made the same remark. She was besieged with questions about her health and condolences. She had to laugh to jest, to appear lively. From time to time she looked at her husband, who was standing at the end of the terrace talking to two ladies, and the poor woman was overcome by the same shudder, the same embarrassment, as on the day of his first arrival. Thrusting my hand into my pocket and holding the letter tight in it, I stood at a little distance from them all, praying to fate that M should notice me. I longed to cheer her up, to relieve her anxiety if only by a glance, to say a word to her on the sly. But when she did chance to look at me, I dropped my eyes. I saw her distress, and I was not mistaken. To this day, I don't know her secret. I know nothing but what I saw and what I have just described. The intrigue was not such, perhaps, as one might suppose at the first glance. Perhaps that kiss was the kiss of farewell. Perhaps it was the last slight reward for the sacrifice made to her peace and honor. N was going away, he was leaving her, perhaps forever. Even that letter I was holding in my hand, who can tell what it contained? How can one judge? And who can condemn? And yet there is no doubt that the sudden discovery of her secret would have been terrible, would have been a fatal blow for her. I still remember her face at that minute. It could not have shown more suffering. To feel, to know, to be convinced, to expect, as though it were one's execution, that in a quarter of an hour, in a minute perhaps, all might be discovered, the letter might be found by someone, picked up. There was no address on it, it might be opened, and then? What then? What torture could be worse than what was awaiting her? She moved about among those who would be her judges. In another minute, their smiling, flattering faces would be menacing and merciless. She would read mockery, malice, and icy contempt on those faces, and then her life would be plunged in everlasting darkness, with no dawn to follow. Yes, I did not understand it then, as I understand it now. I could only have vague suspicions and misgivings, and a heartache at the thought of her danger, which I could not fully understand. But whatever lay hidden in her secret, much was expiated, if expiation were needed, by those moments of anguish of which I was witness, and which I shall never forget. But then came a cheerful summons to set off. Immediately everyone was bustling about gaily. Laughter and lively chatter were heard on all sides. Within 2 minutes, the veranda was deserted. M declined to join the party, acknowledging at last that she was not well. But thank God, all the others set off, everyone was in haste, and there was no time to worry her with commiseration, inquiries, and advice. A few remained at home. Her husband said a few words to her. She answered that she would be all right directly, that he need not be uneasy, that there was no occasion for her to lie down, that she would go into the garden alone. With me. Here she glanced at me. Nothing could be more fortunate. I flushed with pleasure, with delight. A minute later we were on the way. She walked along the same avenues and paths by which she had returned from the copse, instinctively remembering the way she had come, gazing before her with her eyes fixed on the ground, looking about intently without answering me, possibly forgetting that I was walking beside her. But when we had already reached the place where I had picked up the letter, and the path ended, M suddenly stopped, and in a voice faint and weak with misery said that she felt worse, and that she would go home. But when she reached the garden fence, she stopped again and thought a minute. A smile of despair came on her lips, and utterly worn out and exhausted, resigned, and making up her mind to the worst, she turned without a word and retraced her steps, even forgetting to tell me of her intention. My heart was torn with sympathy, and I did not know what to do. We went, or rather I led her, to the place from which an hour before I had heard the tramp of a horse and their conversation. Here, close to a shady elm tree, was a seat hewn out of one huge stone, about which grew ivy, wild jasmine, and dog rose. The whole wood was dotted with little bridges, arbors, grottos, and similar surprises. MME. M. Sat down on the bench and glanced unconsciously at the marvelous view that lay open before us. A minute later, she opened her book and fixed her eyes upon it without reading, without turning the pages, almost unconscious of what she was doing. It was about 9:30. The sun was already high and was floating gloriously in the deep, dark blue sky, as though melting away in its own light. The mowers were by now far away. They were scarcely visible from our side of the river. Endless ridges of mown grass crept after them in unbroken succession, and from time to time the faintly stirring breeze wafted their fragrance to us. The never-ceasing concert of those who sow not, neither do they reap, and are free as the air they cleave with their sportive wings was all about us. It seemed as though at that moment every flower, every blade of grass was exhaling the aroma of sacrifice, was saying to its creator, "Father, I am blessed and happy." I glanced at the poor woman, who alone was like one dead amidst all this joyous life. 2 big tears hung motionless on her lashes, wrung from her heart by bitter grief. It was in my power to relieve and console this poor, fainting heart, only I did not know how to approach the subject, how to take the first step. I was in agonies. 100 times I was on the point of going up to her, but every time my face glowed like fire. Suddenly a bright idea dawned upon me. I had found a way of doing it. I revived. "Would you like me to pick you a nosegay?" I said, in such a joyful voice that MMEM immediately raised her head and looked at me intently. "Yes, do," she said at last in a weak voice, with a faint smile, at once dropping her eyes on the book again. "Or soon they will be mowing the grass here and there will be no flowers," I cried, eagerly setting to work. I had soon picked my nosegay, a poor, simple one. I should have been ashamed to take it indoors. But how light my heart was as I picked the flowers and tied them up. The dog rose and the wild jasmine I picked closer to the seat. I knew that not far off there was a field of rye, not yet ripe. I ran there for cornflowers. I mixed them with tall ears of rye, picking out the finest and most golden. Close by I came upon a perfect nest of forget-me-nots, and my nosegay was almost complete. Farther away in the meadow, there were dark blue campanulas and wild pinks, and I ran down to the very edge of the river to get yellow water lilies. At last, making my way back, and going for an instant into the wood to get some bright green fan-shaped leaves of the maple to put round the nosegay, I happened to come across a whole family of pansies, close to which, luckily for me, the fragrant scent of violets betrayed the little flower hiding in the thick, lush grass and still glistening with drops of dew. The nosegay was complete. I bound it round with fine, long grass which twisted into a rope, and I carefully lay the letter in the center, hiding it with the flowers, but in such a way that it could be very easily noticed if the slightest attention were bestowed upon my nosegay. I carried it to MME. On the way it seemed to me that the letter was lying too much in view. I hid it a little more. As I got nearer, I thrust it still further in the flowers. And finally, when I was on the spot, I suddenly poked it so deeply into the center of the nosegay that it could not be noticed at all from outside. My cheeks were positively flaming. I wanted to hide my face in my hands and run away at once, but she glanced at my flowers as though she had completely forgot that I had gathered them. Mechanically, almost without looking, she held out her hand and took my present, but at once laid it on the seat as though I had handed it to her for that purpose and dropped her eyes to her book again, seeming lost in thought. I was ready to cry at this mischance. If only my nosegay were close to her, I thought. If only she had not forgotten it. I lay down on the grass not far off, put my right arm under my head, and closed my eyes as though I were overcome by drowsiness. But I waited, keeping my eyes fixed on her. 10 minutes passed. It seemed to me that she was getting paler and paler. Fortunately, a blessed chance came to my aid. This was a big golden bee, brought by a kindly breeze, luckily for me. It first buzzed over my head, and then flew up to MME. She waved it off once or twice, but the bee grew more and more persistent. At last MME snatched up my nosegay and waved it before my face. At that instant, the letter dropped out from among the flowers and fell straight upon the open book. I started. For some time, MME. Mute with amazement, stared first at the letter and then at the flowers which she was holding in her hands, and she seemed unable to believe her eyes. All at once she flushed, started, and glanced at me. But I caught her movement, and I shut my eyes tight, pretending to be asleep. Nothing would have induced me to look her straight in the face at that moment. My heart was throbbing and leaping like a bird in the grasp of some village boy. I don't remember how long I lay with my eyes shut, 2 or 3 minutes. At last I ventured to open them. MME. M was greedily reading the letter, and from her glowing cheeks, her sparkling, tearful eyes, her bright face, every feature of which was quivering with joyful emotion, I guessed that there was happiness in the letter and all her misery was dispersed like smoke. An agonizing, sweet feeling gnawed at my heart. It was hard for me to go on pretending. I shall never forget that minute. Suddenly, a long way off, we heard voices. MME. M. Natalie. Natalie. MME. M. Did not answer, but she got up quickly from the seat, came up to me and bent over me. I felt that she was looking straight into my face. My eyelashes quivered, but I controlled myself and did not open my eyes. I tried to breathe more evenly and quietly, but my heart smothered me with its violent throbbing. Her burning breath scorched my cheeks. She bent close down to my face as though trying to make sure. At last a kiss and tears fell on my hand, the one which was lying on my breast. Natalie. Natalie. Where are you? We heard again, this time quite close. Coming, said MME. M in her mellow, silvery voice, which was so choked and quivering with tears, and so subdued that no one but I could hear that. Coming. But at that instant, my heart at last betrayed me, and seemed to send all my blood rushing to my face. At that instant, a swift, burning kiss scalded my lips. I uttered a faint cry. I opened my eyes, but at once the same gauze kerchief fell upon them, as though she meant to screen me from the sun. An instant later she was gone. I heard nothing but the sound of rapidly retreating steps. I was alone. I pulled off her kerchief and kissed it, beside myself with rapture. For some moments I was almost frantic. Hardly able to breathe, leaning on my elbow on the grass, I stared unconsciously before me at the surrounding slopes, streaked with cornfields, at the river that flowed twisting and winding far away, as far as the eye could see, between fresh hills and villages that gleamed like dots all over the sunlit distance at the dark blue, hardly visible forests, which seemed as though smoking at the edge of the burning sky. And a sweet stillness, inspired by the triumphant peacefulness of the picture, gradually brought calm to my troubled heart. I felt more at ease and breathed more freely, but my whole soul was full of a dumb, sweet yearning, as though a veil had been drawn from my eyes as though at a foretaste of something. My frightened heart, faintly quivering with expectation, was groping timidly and joyfully towards some conjecture. And all at once my bosom heaved, began aching as though something had pierced it, and tears, sweet tears, gushed from my eyes. I hid my face in my hands, and quivering like a blade of grass, gave myself up to the first consciousness and revelation of my heart, the first vague glimpse of my nature. My childhood was over from that moment. When 2 hours later I returned home, I did not find MME. M. Through some sudden chance, she had gone back to Moscow with her husband. I never saw her again. Mr. Prohartchin. A story. In the darkest and humblest corner of Astinya Fyodorovna's flat lived Semyon Ivanovich Prohartchin, a well-meaning elderly man who did not drink. Since Mr. Prohartchin was of a very humble grade in the service, and received a salary strictly proportionate to his official capacity, Astinya Fyodorovna could not get more than 5 rubles a month from him for his lodging. Some people said that she had her own reasons for accepting him as a lodger. But be that as it may, as though in despite of all his detractors, Mr. Prohartchin actually became her favorite in an honorable and virtuous sense, of course. It must be observed that Astinya Fyodorovna, a very respectable woman who had a special partiality for meat and coffee, and found it difficult to keep the fasts, let rooms to several other boarders who paid twice as much as Semyon Ivanovitch, yet not being quiet lodgers. But on the contrary, all of them, spiteful scoffers, at her feminine ways and her forlorn helplessness, stood very low in her good opinion, so that if it had not been for the rent they paid, she would not have cared to let them stay, nor indeed to see them in her flat at all. Semyon Ivanovitch had become her favorite from the day when a retired, or, perhaps more correctly speaking, discharged clerk, with a weakness for strong drink, was carried to his last resting place in Volkovo. Though this gentleman had only one eye, having had the other knocked out owing, in his own words, to his valiant behavior, and only one leg, the other having been broken in the same way owing to his valor. Yet he had succeeded in winning all the kindly feeling of which Ustinya Fyodorovna was capable, and took the fullest advantage of it, and would probably have gone on for years living as her devoted satellite, and toady if he had not finally drunk himself to death in the most pitiable way. All this had happened at Pesky, where Ustinya Fyodorovna only had 3 lodgers, of whom, when she moved into a new flat and set up on a larger scale, letting to about a dozen new boarders, Mr. Prohartchin was the only one who remained. Whether Mr. Prohartchin had certain incorrigible defects, or whether his companions were, every one of them, to blame, there seemed to be misunderstandings on both sides from the first. We must observe here that all Ustinya Fyodorovna's new lodgers, without exception, got on together like brothers. Some of them were in the same office. Each one of them by turns lost all his money to the others at faro, preference, and bix. They all liked in a merry hour to enjoy what they called the fizzing moments of life in a crowd together. They were fond, too, at times of discussing lofty subjects. And though in the end things rarely passed off without a dispute, yet as all prejudices were banished from the whole party, the general harmony was not in the least disturbed thereby. The most remarkable among the lodgers were Mark Ivanovitch, an intelligent and well-read man, then Oplovanev, then Propalavenko, also a nice and modest person. Then there was a certain Zinavi Prokofyevitch, whose object in life was to get into aristocratic society. Then there was Okanov, the copying clerk, who had in his time almost wrested the distinction of prime favorite from Semyon Ivanovitch. Then another copying clerk called Sudbin, the plebeian Kanterv. There were others too. But to all these people Semyon Ivanovitch was, as it were, not one of themselves. No one wished him harm, of course, for all had from the very first done Prohartchin justice, and had decided in Mark Ivanovitch's words that he, Prohartchin, was a good and harmless fellow, though by no means a man of the world, trustworthy, and not a flatterer, who had, of course, his failings, but that if he were sometimes unhappy it was due to nothing else but lack of imagination. What is more, Mr. Prohartchin, though deprived in this way of imagination, could never have made a particularly favorable impression from his figure or manners, upon which scoffers are fond of fastening, yet his figure did not put people against him. Mark Ivanovitch, who was an intelligent person, formally undertook Semyon Ivanovitch's defense, and declared in rather happy and flowery language that Prohartchin was an elderly and respectable man, who had long, long ago passed the age of romance. And so, if Semyon Ivanovitch did not know how to get on with people, it must have been entirely his own fault. The first thing they noticed was the unmistakable parsimony and niggardliness of Semyon Ivanovitch. That was at once observed and noted, for Semyon Ivanovitch would never lend anyone his teapot, even for a moment. And that was the more unjust as he himself hardly ever drank tea, but when he wanted anything drank, as a rule, rather a pleasant decoction of wild flowers and certain medicinal herbs, of which he always had a considerable store. His meals, too, were quite different from the other lodgers. He never, for instance, permitted himself to partake of the whole dinner, provided daily by Ustinya Fyodorovna for the other boarders. The dinner cost half a ruble. Semyon Ivanovitch paid only 25 kopecks in copper, and never exceeded it, and so took either a plate of soup with pie or a plate of beef. Most frequently he ate neither soup nor beef, but he partook in moderation of white bread with onion, curd, salted cucumber, or something similar, which was a great deal cheaper, and he would only go back to his half-ruble dinner when he could stand it no longer. Here the biographer confesses that nothing would have induced him to allude to such realistic and low details, positively shocking and offensive to some lovers of the heroic style. if it were not that these details exhibit one peculiarity, one characteristic, in the hero of this story. For Mr. Prohartchin was by no means so poor as to be unable to have regular and sufficient meals, though he sometimes made out that he was. But he acted as he did regardless of obloquy and people's prejudices, simply to satisfy his strange whims and from frugality and excessive carefulness. All this, however, will be much clearer later on. But we will beware of boring the reader with the description of all Semyon Ivanovitch's whims, and will omit, for instance, the curious and very amusing description of his attire. And, in fact, if it were not for Ustinya Fyodorovna's own reference to it, we should hardly have alluded even to the fact that Semyon Ivanovitch never could make up his mind to send his linen to the wash. Or if he ever did so, it was so rarely that in the intervals one might have completely forgotten the existence of linen on Semyon Ivanovitch. From the landlady's evidence, it appeared that Semyon Ivanovitch, bless his soul, poor lamb, for 20 years had been tucked away in his corner, without caring what folks thought. For all the days of his life on earth he was a stranger to socks, handkerchiefs, and all such things. And what is more, Ustinya Fyodorovna had seen with her own eyes, thanks to the decrepitude of the screen, that the poor dear man sometimes had had nothing to cover his bare skin. Such were the rumors in circulation after Semyon Ivanovitch's death. But in his lifetime, and this was one of the most frequent occasions of dissension, he could not endure it if anyone, even somebody on friendly terms with him, poked his inquisitive nose uninvited into his corner, even through an aperture in the decrepit screen. He was a taciturn man, difficult to deal with and prone to ill health. He did not like people to give him advice, he did not care for people who put themselves forward either, and if anyone jeered at him or gave him advice unasked, he would fall foul of him at once, put him to shame, and settle his business. You are a puppy, you are a featherhead, you are not one to give advice, so there you mind your own business, sir. You'd better count the stitches in your own socks, sir, so there. Semyon Ivanovitch was a plain man, and never used the formal mode of address to anyone. He could not bear it either when someone who knew his little ways would begin from pure sport pestering him with questions, such as what he had in his little trunk. Semyon Ivanovitch had one little trunk. It stood under his bed and was guarded like the apple of his eye. And though everyone knew that there was nothing in it except old rags, 2 or 3 pairs of damaged boots and all sorts of rubbish, yet Mr. Prohartchin prized his property very highly, and they used even to hear him at one time express dissatisfaction with his old, but still sound, lock, and talk of getting a new one of a special German pattern with a secret spring and various complications. When on one occasion Zinovy Prokofyevitch, carried away by the thoughtlessness of youth, gave expression to the very coarse and unseemly idea that Semyon Ivanovitch was probably hiding and treasuring something in his box to leave to his descendants, everyone who happened to be by was stupefied at the extraordinary effects of Zinovy Prokofyevitch's sally. At first Mr. Prohartchin could not find suitable terms for such a crude and coarse idea. For a long time words dropped from his lips quite incoherently, and it was only after a while they made out that Semyon Ivanovitch was reproaching Zinovy Prokofyevitch for some shabby action in the remote past. Then they realized that Semyon Ivanovitch was predicting that Zinovy Prokofyevitch would never get into aristocratic society, and that the tailor to whom he owed a bill for his suits would certainly beat him because the puppy had not paid him for so long. And finally, you puppy, you, Semyon Ivanovitch added, here you want to get into the hussars, but you won't. I tell you, you'll make a fool of yourself. And I tell you what, you puppy, when your superiors know all about it, they will take and make you a copying clerk. So that will be the end of it. Do you hear, puppy? Then Semyon Ivanovitch subsided, but after lying down for 5 hours, to the intense astonishment of everyone he seemed to have reached a decision, and began suddenly reproaching and abusing the young man again, at first to himself and afterwards addressing Zinovy Prokofyevitch. But the matter did not end there, and in the evening, when Mark Ivanovitch and Propolovenko made tea and asked Okanov to drink it with them, Semyon Ivanovitch got up from his bed, purposely joined them, subscribing his 15 or 20 kopecks, and on the pretext of a sudden desire for a cup of tea began at great length going into the subject, and explaining that he was a poor man, nothing but a poor man, and that a poor man like him had nothing to save. Mr. Prohartchin confessed that he was a poor man on this occasion, he said, simply because the subject had come up. That the day before yesterday he had meant to borrow a ruble from that impudent fellow, but now he should not borrow it for fear the puppy should brag, that was the fact of the matter, and that his salary was such that one could not buy enough to eat, and that finally, a poor man, as you see, he sent his sister-in-law in tver 5 rubles every month, that if he did not send his sister-in-law in tver 5 rubles every month his sister-in-law would die, and if his sister-in-law, who was dependent on him, were dead, he, Semyon Ivanovitch, would long ago have bought himself a new suit. And Semyon Ivanovitch went on talking in this way at great length about being a poor man, about his sister-in-law and about rubles, and kept repeating the same thing over and over again to impress it on his audience till he got into a regular muddle and relapsed into silence. Only 3 days later, when they had all forgotten about him, and no one was thinking of attacking him, he added something in conclusion to the effect that when Zinovy Prokofyevitch went into the hussars, the impudent fellow would have his leg cut off in the war, and then he would come with a wooden leg and say, "Semyon Ivanovitch, kind friend, give me something to eat." And then Semyon Ivanovitch would not give him something to eat, and would not look at the insolent fellow. And that's how it would be, and he could just make the best of it. All this naturally seemed very curious, and at the same time fearfully amusing. Without much reflection, all the lodgers joined together for further investigation, and simply from curiosity determined to make a final onslaught on Semyon Ivanovitch en masse. And as Mr. Prohartchin, too, had of late, that is, ever since he had begun living in the same flat with them, been very fond of finding out everything about them and asking inquisitive questions, probably for private reasons of his own, relations sprang up between the opposed parties without any preparation or effort on either side, as it were by chance and of itself. To get into relations, Semyon Ivanovitch always had in reserve his peculiar, rather sly, and very ingenious maneuver, of which the reader has learned something already. He would get off his bed about tea time, and if he saw the others gathered together in a group to make tea, he would go up to them like a quiet, sensible, and friendly person, hand over his 20 kopecks, as he was entitled to do, and announce that he wished to join them. Then the young men would wink at one another, and so indicating that they were in league together against Semyon Ivanovitch, would begin a conversation, at first strictly proper and decorous. Then one of the wittier of the party would, apropos of nothing, fall to telling them news consisting most usually of entirely false and quite incredible details. He would say, for instance, that someone had heard His Excellency that day telling Demid Vassilievitch that in his opinion, married clerks were more trustworthy than unmarried, and more suitable for promotion, for they were steady, and that their capacities were considerably improved by marriage, and that therefore he, that is, the speaker, in order to improve and be better fitted for promotion, was doing his utmost to enter the bonds of matrimony as soon as possible with a certain Fevranya Prokofyevna. Or he would say that it had more than once been remarked about certain of his colleagues that they were entirely devoid of social graces and of well-bred, agreeable manners, and consequently unable to please ladies in good society, and that therefore, to eradicate this defect, it would be suitable to deduct something from their salary, and with the sum so obtained, to hire a hall where they could learn to dance, acquire the outward signs of gentlemanliness and good breeding, courtesy, respect for their seniors, strength of will, a good and grateful heart, and various agreeable qualities. Or he would say that it was being arranged that some of the clerks, beginning with the most elderly, were to be put through an examination in all sorts of subjects to raise their standard of culture. And in that way, the speaker would add, all sorts of things would come to light, and certain gentlemen would have to lay their cards on the table. In short, thousands of similar very absurd rumors were discussed. To keep it up, everyone believed the story at once, showed interest in it, asked questions, applied it to themselves. And some of them, assuming a despondent air, began shaking their heads and asking everyone's advice, saying what were they to do if they were to come under it. It need hardly be said that a man far less credulous and simple-hearted than Mr. Prohartchin would have been puzzled and carried away by a rumor so unanimously believed. Moreover, from all appearances, it might be safely concluded that Semyon Ivanovitch was exceedingly stupid and slow to grasp any new unusual idea, and that when he heard anything new, he had always first, as it were, to chew it over and digest it, to find out the meaning, and struggling with it in bewilderment, at last perhaps to overcome it, though even then in a quite special manner peculiar to himself alone. In this way, curious and hitherto unexpected qualities began to show themselves in Semyon Ivanovitch. Talk and tittle-tattle followed, and by devious ways it all reached the office at last, with additions. What increased the sensation was the fact that Mr. Prohartchin, who had looked almost exactly the same from time immemorial, suddenly, apropos of nothing, wore quite a different countenance. His face was uneasy, his eyes were timid and had a scared and rather suspicious expression. He took to walking softly, starting and listening, and to put the finishing touch to his new characteristics, developed a passion for investigating the truth. He carried his love of truth at last to such a pitch as to venture, on 2 occasions, to inquire of Demid Vassilievich himself concerning the credibility of the strange rumors that reached him daily by dozens. And if we say nothing here of the consequence of the action of Semyon Ivanovitch, it is for no other reason but a sensitive regard for his reputation. It was in this way people came to consider him as misanthropic and regardless of the proprieties. Then they began to discover that there was a great deal that was fantastical about him, and in this they were not altogether mistaken, for it was observed on more than one occasion that Semyon Ivanovitch completely forgot himself, and sitting in his seat with his mouth open and his pen in the air, as though frozen or petrified, looked more like the shadow of a rational being than that rational being itself. It sometimes happened that some innocently gaping gentleman, on suddenly catching his straying, lusterless, questioning eyes, was scared and all of a tremor, and at once inserted into some important document either a smudge or some quite inappropriate word. The impropriety of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior embarrassed and annoyed all really well-bred people. At last, no one could feel any doubt of the eccentricity of Semyon Ivanovitch's mind, when one fine morning the rumor was all over the office that Mr. Prohartchin had actually frightened Demid Vassilievich himself. For, meeting him in the corridor, Semyon Ivanovitch had been so strange and peculiar that he had forced his superior to beat a retreat. The news of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior reached him himself at last. Hearing of it, he got up at once, made his way carefully between the chairs and tables, reached the entry, took down his overcoat with his own hand, put it on, went out, and disappeared for an indefinite period. Whether he was led into this by alarm or some other impulse we cannot say, but no trace was seen of him for a time either at home or at the office. We will not attribute Semyon Ivanovitch's fate simply to his eccentricity, yet we must observe to the reader that our hero was a very retiring man, unaccustomed to society, and had, until he made the acquaintance of the new lodgers, lived in complete unbroken solitude, and had been marked by his quietness and even a certain mysteriousness, for he had spent all the time that he lodged at Pesky lying on his bed behind the screen, without talking or having any sort of relations with anyone. Both his old fellow-lodgers lived exactly as he did. They, too, were, somehow mysterious people and spent 15 years lying behind their screens. The happy, drowsy hours and days trailed by, one after the other, in patriarchal stagnation, and as everything around them went its way in the same happy fashion, neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor Ustinya Fyodorovna could remember exactly when fate had brought them together. It may be 10 years, it may be 20, it may be even 25 altogether, she would say at times to her new lodgers, since he settled with me, poor dear man, bless his heart. And so it was very natural that the hero of our story, being so unaccustomed to society, was disagreeably surprised when, a year before, he, a respectable and modest man, had found himself suddenly in the midst of a noisy and boisterous crew, consisting of a dozen young fellows, his colleagues at the office, and his new housemates. The disappearance of Semyon Ivanovitch made no little stir in the lodgings. One thing was that he was the favorite. Another, that his passport, which had been in the landlady's keeping, appeared to have been accidentally mislaid. Ustinya Fyodorovna raised a howl, as was her invariable habit on all critical occasions. She spent 2 days in abusing and upbraiding the lodgers. She wailed that they had chased away her lodger like a chicken, and all those spiteful scoffers had been the ruin of him. And on the 3rd day, she sent them all out to hunt for the fugitive and at all costs to bring him back, dead or alive. Towards evening, Sudbin first came back with the news that traces had been discovered, that he had himself seen the runaway in Talkachi Market and other places, had followed and stood close to him, but had not dared to speak to him. He had been near him in a crowd watching a house on fire in Crooked Lane. Half an hour later, Okanov and Kanterv came in and confirmed Sudbin's story, word for word. They, too, had stood near, had followed him quite close, had stood not more than 10 paces from him, but they also had not ventured to speak to him, but both observed that Semyon Ivanovitch was walking with a drunken cadger. The other lodgers were all back and together at last, and after listening attentively, they made up their minds that Prohartchin could not be far off and would not be long in returning. But they said that they had all known beforehand that he was about with a drunken cadger. This drunken cadger was a thoroughly bad lot, insolent and cringing, and it seemed evident that he had got round Semyon Ivanovitch in some way. He had turned up just a week before Semyon Ivanovitch's disappearance in company with Remnev, had spent a little time in the flat telling them that he had suffered in the cause of justice, that he had formerly been in the service in the provinces, that an inspector had come down on them, that he and his associates had somehow suffered in a good cause, that he had come to Petersburg and fallen at the feet of Porfiry Grigorievich, that he had been got, by interest, into a department. But through the cruel persecution of fate, he had been discharged from there too, and that afterwards through reorganization, the office itself had ceased to exist, and that he had not been included in the new revised staff of clerks, owing as much to direct incapacity for official work, as to capacity for something else quite irrelevant, all this mixed up with his passion for justice, and of course the trickery of his enemies. After finishing his story, in the course of which Mr. Zimovkin more than once kissed his sullen and unshaven friend Remnev, he bowed down to all in the room in turn, not forgetting Avditia the servant, called them all his benefactors, and explained that he was an undeserving, troublesome, mean, insolent and stupid man, and that good people must not be hard on his pitiful plight and simplicity. After begging for their kind protection, Mr. Zimovkin showed his livelier side, grew very cheerful, kissed Ustinya Fyodorovna's hands, in spite of her modest protests that her hand was coarse and not like a lady's, and towards evening promised to show the company his talent in a remarkable character dance. But next day, his visit ended in a lamentable denouement. Either because there had been too much character in the character dance, or because he had, in Ustinya Fyodorovna's own words, somehow insulted her and treated her as no lady, though she was on friendly terms with Yaroslav Ilyich himself, and if she liked might long ago have been an officer's wife. Zimovkin had to steer for home next day. He went away, came back again, was again turned out with ignominy, then wormed his way into Semyon Ivanovitch's good graces, robbed him incidentally of his new breeches, and now it appeared he had led Semyon Ivanovitch astray. As soon as the landlady knew that Semyon Ivanovitch was alive and well, and that there was no need to hunt for his passport, she promptly left off grieving and was pacified. Meanwhile, some of the lodgers determined to give the runaway a triumphal reception. They broke the bolt and moved away the screen from Mr. Prohartchin's bed, rumpled up the bed a little, took the famous box, put it at the foot of the bed, and on the bed laid the sister-in-law, that is, a dummy made up of an old kerchief, a cap and a mantle of the landlady's, such an exact counterfeit of a sister-in-law that it might have been mistaken for one. Having finished their work, they waited for Semyon Ivanovitch to return, meaning to tell him that his sister-in-law had arrived from the country and was there behind his screen, poor thing. But they waited and waited. Already, while they waited, Mark Ivanovitch had staked and lost half a month's salary to Propolovenko and Kanterv. Already Okanov's nose had grown red and swollen playing flips on the nose and 3 cards. Already Avditia, the servant, had almost had her sleep out and had twice been on the point of getting up to fetch the wood and light the stove. And Zinovy Prokofyevitch, who kept running out every minute to see whether Semyon Ivanovitch were coming, was wet to the skin. But there was no sign of any one, yet neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor the drunken cadger. At last, everyone went to bed, leaving the sister-in-law behind the screen in readiness for any emergency. And it was not till 4 o'clock that a knock was heard at the gate. But when it did come, it was so loud that it quite made up to the expectant lodgers for all the wearisome trouble they had been through. It was he himself, Semyon Ivanovitch, Mr. Prohartchin, but in such a condition that they all cried out in dismay, and no one thought about the sister-in-law. The lost man was unconscious. He was brought in, or more correctly carried in, by a sopping and tattered night cabman. To the landlady's question where the poor dear man had got so groggy, the cabman answered, "Why, he is not drunk and has not had a drop, that I can tell you for sure. But seemingly a faintness has come over him, or some sort of a fit, or maybe he's been knocked down by a blow." They began examining him, propping the culprit against the stove to do so more conveniently, and saw that it really was not a case of drunkenness, nor had he had a blow, but that something else was wrong, for Semyon Ivanovitch could not utter a word, but seemed twitching in a sort of convulsion, and only blinked, fixing his eyes in bewilderment first on one and then on another of the spectators, who were all attired in night array. Then they began questioning the cabman, asking where he had got him from. "Why, from folks out Kolomna way," he answered. "Deuce knows what they are, not exactly gentry, but merry, rollicking gentlemen. So he was like this when they gave him to me. Whether they had been fighting, or whether he was in some sort of a fit, goodness knows what it was. But they were nice, jolly gentlemen." Semyon Ivanovitch was taken, lifted high on the shoulders of 2 or 3 sturdy fellows, and carried to his bed. When Semyon Ivanovitch, on being put in bed, felt the sister-in-law, and put his feet on his sacred box, he cried out at the top of his voice, squatted up almost on his heels, and trembling and shaking all over, with his hands and his body he cleared a space as far as he could in his bed. While gazing with a tremulous but strangely resolute look at those present, he seemed as it were to protest that he would sooner die than give up the 100th part of his poor belongings to anyone. Semyon Ivanovitch lay for 2 or 3 days closely barricaded by the screen, and so cut off from all the world and all its vain anxieties. Next morning, of course, everyone had forgotten about him. Time, meanwhile, flew by as usual, hour followed hour and day followed day. The sick man's heavy, feverish brain was plunged in something between sleep and delirium, but he lay quietly and did not moan or complain. On the contrary, he kept still and silent and controlled himself, lying low in his bed, just as the hare lies close to the earth when it hears the hunter. At times, a long, depressing stillness prevailed in the flat, a sign that the lodgers had all gone to the office, and Semyon Ivanovitch, waking up, could relieve his depression by listening to the bustle in the kitchen, where the landlady was busy close by, or to the regular flop of Avdiyia's downtrodden slippers as, sighing and moaning, she cleared away, rubbed and polished, tidying all the rooms in the flat. Whole hours passed by in that way, drowsy, languid, sleepy, wearisome, like the water that dripped with a regular sound from the locker into the basin in the kitchen. At last the lodgers would arrive, one by one or in groups, and Semyon Ivanovitch could very conveniently hear them abusing the weather, saying they were hungry, making a noise, smoking, quarreling and making friends, playing cards and clattering the cups as they got ready for tea. Semyon Ivanovitch mechanically made an effort to get up and join them, as he had a right to do at tea. But he at once sank back into drowsiness, and dreamed that he had been sitting a long time at the tea table, having tea with them and talking, and that Zinovy Prokofyevitch had already seized the opportunity to introduce into the conversation some scheme concerning sisters-in-law and the moral relation of various worthy people to them. At this point, Semyon Ivanovitch was in haste to defend himself and reply. But the mighty formula that flew from every tongue, "It has more than once been observed," cut short all his objections, and Semyon Ivanovitch could do nothing better than begin dreaming again that today was the 1st of the month, and that he was receiving money in his office. Undoing the paper rounded on the stairs, he looked about him quickly, and made haste as fast as he could to subtract half of the lawful wages he had received and conceal it in his boot. Then on the spot, on the stairs, quite regardless of the fact that he was in bed and asleep, he made up his mind when he reached home to give his landlady what was due for board and lodging, then to buy certain necessities, and to show anyone it might concern, as it were casually and unintentionally, that some of his salary had been deducted, that now he had nothing left to send his sister-in-law. Then to speak with commiseration of his sister-in-law, to say a great deal about her the next day and the day after, and 10 days later to say something casually again about her poverty, that his companions might not forget. Making this determination, he observed that Andrei Efimovitch, that everlastingly silent, bald little man who sat in the office 3 rooms from where Semyon Ivanovitch sat, and hadn't said a word to him for 20 years, was standing on the stairs, that he, too, was counting his silver rubles, and shaking his head, he said to him, "Money. If there's no money there will be no porridge," he added grimly as he went down the stairs, and just at the door he ended, "And I have 7 children, sir." Then the little bald man, probably equally unconscious that he was acting as a phantom and not as a substantial reality, held up his hand about 30 inches from the floor, and waving it vertically, muttered that the eldest was going to school, then glancing with indignation at Semyon Ivanovitch, as though it were Mr. Prohartchin's fault that he was the father of 7, pulled his old hat down over his eyes, and with a whisk of his overcoat, he turned to the left and disappeared. Semyon Ivanovitch was quite frightened, and though he was fully convinced of his own innocence in regard to the unpleasant accumulation of 7 under one roof, yet it seemed to appear that in fact no one else was to blame but Semyon Ivanovitch. Panic-stricken, he set off running, for it seemed to him that the bald gentleman had turned back, was running after him, and meant to search him and take away all his salary, insisting upon the indisputable number 7, and resolutely denying any possible claim of any sort of sisters-in-law upon Semyon Ivanovitch. Prohartchin ran and ran, gasping for breath. Beside him was running, too, an immense number of people, and all of them were jingling their money in the tail-pockets of their skimpy little dress coats. At last everyone ran up, there was the noise of fire engines, and whole masses of people carried him almost on their shoulders up to that same house on fire which he had watched last time in company with the drunken cadger. The drunken cadgeralious Mr. Zimuvikin was there now, too. He met Semyon Ivanovitch, made a fearful fuss, took him by the arm, and led him into the thickest part of the crowd. Just as then in reality, all about them was the noise and uproar of an immense crowd of people, flooding the whole of Fontanka embankment between the 2 bridges, as well as all the surrounding streets and alleys. Just as then, Semyon Ivanovitch, in company with the drunken cadger, was carried along behind a fence, where they were squeezed as though in pincers in a huge timber yard full of spectators who had gathered from the street, from Tolkachi market, and from all the surrounding houses, taverns, and restaurants. Semyon Ivanovitch saw all this and felt as he had done at the time. In the whirl of fever and delirium, all sorts of strange figures began flitting before him. He remembered some of them. One of them was a gentleman who had impressed everyone extremely, a man 7 feet high, with whiskers half a yard long, who had been standing behind Semyon Ivanovitch's back during the fire, and had given him encouragement from behind when our hero had felt something like ecstasy, and had stamped as though intending thereby to applaud the gallant work of the firemen, from which he had an excellent view from his elevated position. Another was the sturdy lad from whom our hero had received a shove by way of a lift on to another fence, when he had been disposed to climb over it, possibly to save someone. He had a glimpse, too, of the figure of the old man with a sickly face, in an old wadded dressing gown, tied round the waist, who had made his appearance before the fire in a little shop buying sugar and tobacco for his lodger, and who now, with a milk can and a quart pot in his hands, made his way through the crowd to the house in which his wife and daughter were burning together with 13.5 rubles in the corner under the bed. But most distinct of all was the poor, sinful woman of whom he had dreamed more than once during his illness. She stood before him, now as she had done then, in wretched bark shoes and rags, with a crutch and a wicker basket on her back. She was shouting more loudly than the firemen or the crowd, waving her crutch and her arms, saying that her own children had turned her out and that she had lost 2 coppers in consequence. The children and the coppers and the children were mingled together in an utterly incomprehensible muddle, from which everyone withdrew baffled, after vain efforts to understand. But the woman would not desist. She kept wailing, shouting, and waving her arms, seeming to pay no attention either to the fire up to which she had been carried by the crowd from the street, or to the people about her, or to the misfortune of strangers, or even to the sparks and red-hot embers which were beginning to fall in showers on the crowd standing near. At last Mr. Prohartchin felt that a feeling of terror was coming upon him, for he saw clearly that all this was not, so to say, an accident, and that he would not get off scot-free. And indeed, upon the woodstack, close to him, was a peasant, in a torn smock that hung loose about him, with his hair and beard singed, and he began stirring up all the people against Semyon Ivanovitch. The crowd pressed closer and closer. The peasant shouted, and foaming at the mouth with horror, Mr. Prohartchin suddenly realized that this peasant was a cabman whom he had cheated 5 years before in the most inhuman way, slipping away from him without paying through a side gate and jerking up his heels as he ran as though he were barefoot on hot bricks. In despair, Mr. Prohartchin tried to speak, to scream, but his voice failed him. He felt that the infuriated crowd was twining round him like a many-colored snake, strangling him, crushing him. He made an incredible effort and awoke. Then he saw that he was on fire, that all his corner was on fire, that his screen was on fire, that the whole flat was on fire, together with Ustinya Fyodorovna and all her lodgers, that his bed was burning, his pillow, his quilt, his box, and last of all, his precious mattress. Semyon Ivanovitch jumped up, clutched at the mattress, and ran dragging it after him. But in the landlady's room into which, regardless of decorum, our hero ran just as he was, barefoot and in his shirt, he was seized, held tight, and triumphantly carried back behind the screen, which meanwhile was not on fire. It seemed that it was rather Semyon Ivanovitch's head that was on fire and was put back to bed. It was just as some tattered, unshaven, ill-humored organ grinder puts away in his traveling box the punch who has been making an upset, drubbing all the other puppets, selling his soul to the devil, and who at last ends his existence, till the next performance, in the same box with the devil, the Negroes, the Pierrot, and Mademoiselle Katerina with her fortunate lover, the captain. Immediately everyone, old and young, surrounded Semyon Ivanovitch, standing in a row round his bed and fastening eyes full of expectation on the invalid. Meantime he had come to himself, but from shame or some other feeling, began pulling up the quilt over him, apparently wishing to hide himself under it from the attention of his sympathetic friends. At last Mark Ivanovitch was the first to break silence, and as a sensible man he began saying in a very friendly way that Semyon Ivanovitch must keep calm, that it was too bad and a shame to be ill, that only little children behaved like that he must get well and go to the office. Mark Ivanovitch ended by a little joke, saying that no regular salary had yet been fixed for invalids, and as he knew for a fact that their grade would be very low in the service, to his thinking anyway, their calling or condition did not promise great and substantial advantages. In fact, it was evident that they were all taking genuine interest in Semyon Ivanovitch's fate and were very sympathetic. But with incomprehensible rudeness, Semyon Ivanovitch persisted in lying in bed in silence and obstinately pulling the quilt higher and higher over his head. Mark Ivanovitch, however, would not be gainsaid, and restraining his feelings, said something very honeyed to Semyon Ivanovitch again, knowing that that was how he ought to treat a sick man. But Semyon Ivanovitch would not feel this. On the contrary, he muttered something between his teeth with the most distrustful air, and suddenly began glancing askance from right to left in a hostile way, as though he would have reduced his sympathetic friends to ashes with his eyes. It was no use letting it stop there. Mark Ivanovitch lost patience, and seeing that the man was offended and completely exasperated, and had simply made up his mind to be obstinate, told him straight out, without any softening suavity, that it was time to get up, that it was no use lying there, that shouting day and night about houses on fire, sisters-in-law, drunken cadgers, locks, boxes, and goodness knows what was all stupid, improper, and degrading. For if Semyon Ivanovitch did not want to sleep himself, he should not hinder other people, and please would he bear it in mind. This speech produced its effects, for Semyon Ivanovitch, turning promptly to the orator, articulated firmly, though in a hoarse voice, "You hold your tongue, puppy. You idle speaker, you foul-mouthed man. Do you hear, young dandy? Are you a prince, eh? Do you understand what I say?" Hearing such insults, Mark Ivanovitch fired up, but realizing that he had to deal with a sick man, magnanimously overcame his resentment and tried to shame him out of his humor, but was cut short in that too. For Semyon Ivanovitch observed at once that he would not allow people to play with him for all that Mark Ivanovitch wrote poetry. Then followed a silence of 2 minutes. At last, recovering from his amazement, Mark Ivanovitch, plainly, clearly, in well-chosen language, but with firmness, declared that Semyon Ivanovitch ought to understand that he was among gentlemen, and you ought to understand, sir, how to behave with gentlemen. Mark Ivanovitch could on occasion speak effectively and liked to impress his hearers, but probably from the habit of years of silence, Semyon Ivanovitch talked and acted somewhat abruptly. And moreover, when he did on occasion begin a long sentence, as he got further into it, every word seemed to lead to another word, that other word to a third word, that third to a fourth, and so on, so that his mouth seemed brimming over. He began stuttering, and the crowding words took to flying out in picturesque disorder. That was why Semyon Ivanovitch, who was a sensible man, sometimes talked terrible nonsense. "You are lying," he said now. "You booby, you loose fellow. You'll come to want you'll go begging, you seditious fellow, you loafer. Take that, you poet. Why, you are still raving, aren't you, Semyon Ivanovitch?" "I tell you what," answered Semyon Ivanovitch, "fools rave, drunkards rave, dogs rave, but a wise man acts sensibly. I tell you, you don't know your own business, you loafer, you educated gentleman, you learned book. Here, you'll get on fire, and not notice your head's burning off. What do you think of that?" "Why, you mean—" "How do you mean, burn my head off, Semyon Ivanovitch?" Mark Ivanovitch said no more, for everyone saw clearly that Semyon Ivanovitch was not yet in his sober senses, but delirious. But the landlady could not resist remarking at this point that the house in Crooked Lane had been burnt owing to a bald wench, that there was a bald-headed wench living there, that she had lighted a candle and set fire to the lumber room, but nothing would happen in her place, and everything would be all right in the flats. "But look here, Semyon Ivanovitch," cried Zinovy Prokofyevitch, losing patience and interrupting the landlady. "You old fogey, you old crock, you silly fellow, are they making jokes with you now about your sister-in-law or examinations in dancing? Is that it? Is that what you think? Now, I tell you what," answered our hero, sitting up in bed and making a last effort in a paroxysm of fury with his sympathetic friends. "Who's the fool? You are the fool, a dog is a fool, you joking gentleman. But I am not going to make jokes to please you, sir. Do you hear, puppy? I am not your servant, sir." Semyon Ivanovitch would have said something more, but he fell back in bed helpless. His sympathetic friends were left gaping in perplexity, for they understood now what was wrong with Semyon Ivanovitch and did not know how to begin. Suddenly the kitchen door creaked and opened, and the drunken, caduralious Mr. Zimovkin timidly thrust in his head, cautiously sniffing round the place as his habit was. It seemed as though he had been expected. Everyone waved to him at once to come quickly, and Zimovkin, highly delighted, with the utmost readiness and haste, jostled his way to Semyon Ivanovitch's bedside. It was evident that Zimovkin had spent the whole night in vigil and in great exertions of some sort. The right side of his face was plastered up. His swollen eyelids were wet from his running eyes, his coat and all his clothes were torn, while the whole left side of his attire was bespattered with something extremely nasty, possibly mud from a puddle. Under his arm was somebody's violin, which he had been taking somewhere to sell. Apparently they had not made a mistake in summoning him to their assistance, for seeing the position of affairs, he addressed the delinquent at once, and with the air of a man who knows what he is about and feels that he has the upper hand, said, "What are you thinking about? Get up, Senka. What are you doing, a clever chap like you? Be sensible, or I shall pull you out of bed if you are obstreperous. Don't be obstreperous." This brief but forcible speech surprised them all. Still more were they surprised when they noticed that Semyon Ivanovitch, hearing all this and seeing this person before him, was so flustered and reduced to such confusion and dismay that he could scarcely mutter through his teeth in a whisper the inevitable protest. "Go away, you wretch," he said. "You are a wretched creature, you are a thief. Do you hear? Do you understand? You are a great swell, my fine gentleman, you regular swell. No, my boy, Zimovicin answered emphatically, retaining all his presence of mind. You're wrong there, you wise fellow, you regular Prohartchin. Zimovicin went on, parodying Semyon Ivanovitch and looking round gleefully. Don't be obstreperous. Behave yourself, Senka, behave yourself, or I'll give you away. I'll tell them all about it, my lad, do you understand? Apparently Semyon Ivanovitch did understand, for he started when he heard the conclusion of the speech, and began looking rapidly about him with an utterly desperate air. Satisfied with the effect, Mr. Zimovicin would have continued, but Mark Ivanovitch checked his zeal, and waiting till Semyon Ivanovitch was still and almost calm again, began judiciously impressing on the uneasy invalid at great length that, to harbor ideas such as he now had in his head was, first, useless, and secondly, not only useless, but harmful, and in fact not so much harmful as positively immoral. And the cause of it all was that Semyon Ivanovitch was not only a bad example, but led them all into temptation. Every one expected satisfactory results from this speech. Moreover, by now Semyon Ivanovitch was quite quiet and replied in measured terms. A quiet discussion followed. They appealed to him in a friendly way, inquiring what he was so frightened of. Semyon Ivanovitch answered, but his answers were irrelevant. They answered him, he answered them. There were one or two more observations on both sides, and then everyone rushed into discussion, for suddenly such a strange and amazing subject cropped up that they did not know how to express themselves. The argument at last led to impatience, impatience led to shouting, and shouting even to tears, and Mark Ivanovitch went away at last foaming at the mouth and declaring that he had never known such a blockhead. Oplavanev spat in disgust, Okhanov was frightened, Zinovy Prokofyevitch became tearful, while Ustinya Fyodorovna positively howled, wailing that her lodger was leaving them and had gone off his head, that he would die, poor dear man, without a passport and without telling anyone, while she was a lone, lorn woman, and that she would be dragged from pillar to post. In fact, they all saw clearly at last that the seed they had sown had yielded 100-fold, that the soil had been too productive, and that in their company, Semyon Ivanovitch had succeeded in overstraining his wits completely and in the most irrevocable manner. Every one subsided into silence, for though they saw that Semyon Ivanovitch was frightened, the sympathetic friends were frightened too. "What?" cried Mark Ivanovitch, "but what are you afraid of? What have you gone off your head about? Who's thinking about you, my good sir? Have you the right to be afraid? Who are you? What are you?" "Nothing, sir." "Around not, sir, that is what you are. What are you making a fuss about? A woman has been run over in the street, so are you going to be run over? Some drunkard did not take care of his pocket, but is that any reason why your coat-tails should be cut off? A house is burnt down, so your head is to be burnt off, is it? Is that it, sir, is that it?" You stupid," muttered Semyon Ivanovitch. "If your nose were cut off you would eat it up with a bit of bread and not notice it." "I may be a dandy," shouted Mark Ivanovitch, not listening. "I may be a regular dandy, but I have not to pass an examination to get married to learn dancing. The ground is firm under me, sir." "Why, my good man, haven't you room enough? Is the floor giving way under your feet, or what? Well, they won't ask you, will they? They'll shut one up, and that will be the end of it." "The end of it? That's what's up. What's your idea now, eh?" "Why, they kicked out the drunken cadger." "Yes, but you see that was a drunkard, and you are a man, and so am I." "Yes, I am a man. It's there all right one day, and then it's gone." "Gone? But what do you mean by it?" "Why, the office. The off-ice. Yes, you blessed man, but of course the office is wanted and necessary. It is wanted, I tell you. It's wanted today and it's wanted tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow it will not be wanted. You have heard what happened. Why, but they'll pay you your salary for the year, you doubting Thomas, you man of little faith. They'll put you into another job on account of your age. Salary? But what if I have spent my salary, if thieves come and take my money? And I have a sister-in-law, do you hear? A sister-in-law? You battering ram. A sister-in-law. You are a man. Yes, I am a man. But you are a well-read gentleman and a fool. Do you hear? You battering ram, you regular battering ram. That's what you are. I am not talking about your jokes, but there are jobs such that all of a sudden they are done away with. And Demid, do you hear? Demid Vasilievich says that the post will be done away with. Ah, bless you with your Demid. You sinner, why, you know. In a twinkling of an eye you'll be left without a post, then you'll just have to make the best of it. Why, you're simply raving, or clean off your head. Tell us plainly, what have you done? Own up if you have done something wrong. It's no use being ashamed. Are you off your head, my good man, eh? He's off his head. He's gone off his head. They all cried and wrung their hands in despair, while the landlady threw both her arms round Mark Ivanovitch for fear he should tear Semyon Ivanovitch to pieces. You heathenish soul, you wise man, Zimovkin besought him. Senka, you are not a man to take offense. You are a polite, prepossessing man. You are simple, you are good. Do you hear? It all comes from your goodness. Here I am a ruffian and a fool, I am a beggar. But good people haven't abandoned me, no fear. You see, they treat me with respect, I thank them and the landlady. Here, you see, I bow down to the ground to them. Here, see, I am paying what is due to you, landlady. At this point, Zimovkin swung off with pedantic dignity, a low bow right down to the ground. After that, Semyon Ivanovitch would have gone on talking. But this time they would not let him. They all intervened, began entreating him, assuring him, comforting him, and succeeded in making Semyon Ivanovitch thoroughly ashamed of himself. And at last, in a faint voice, he asked leave to explain himself. Very well then, he said. I am prepossessing, I am quiet, I am good, faithful and devoted, to the last drop of my blood, you know. Do you hear, you puppy, you swell? Granted the job is going on, but you see I am poor. And what if they take it? Do you hear, you swell? Hold your tongue and try to understand. They'll take it, and that's all about it. It's going on, brother, and then not going on. Do you understand? And I shall go begging my bread, do you hear? Senka, Zimovkin bawled frantically, drowning the general hubbub with his voice. You are seditious. I'll inform against you. What are you saying? Who are you? Are you a rebel, you sheep's head? A rowdy, stupid man they would turn off without a character. But what are you? Well, that's just it. What? Well, there it is. How do you mean? Why, I am free, he's free, and here one lies and thinks. What? What if they say I'm seditious? CDTOs. Senka, you seditious. Stay, cried Mr. Prohartchin, waving his hand and interrupting the rising uproar. That's not what I mean. Try to understand, only try to understand, you sheep. I am law-abiding. I am law-abiding today. I am law-abiding tomorrow. And then all of a sudden they kick me out and call me seditious. What are you saying? Mark Ivanovitch thundered at last, jumping up from the chair on which he had sat down to rest, running up to the bed and in a frenzy shaking with vexation and fury. What do you mean? You sheep. You've nothing to call your own. Why, are you the only person in the world? Was the world made for you, do you suppose? Are you a Napoleon? What are you? Who are you? Are you a Napoleon, eh? Tell me, are you a Napoleon? But Mr. Prohartchin did not answer this question. Not because he was overcome with shame at being a Napoleon and was afraid of taking upon himself such a responsibility, no. He was incapable of disputing further or saying anything. His illness had reached a crisis. Tiny teardrops gushed suddenly from his glittering, feverish, gray eyes. He hid his burning head in his bony hands that were wasted by illness, sat up in bed, and sobbing, began to say that he was quite poor, that he was a simple, unlucky man, that he was foolish and unlearned. He begged kind folks to forgive him, to take care of him, to protect him, to give him food and drink, not to leave him in want, and goodness knows what else Semyon Ivanovitch said. As he uttered this appeal, he looked about him in wild terror, as though he were expecting the ceiling to fall or the floor to give way. Every one felt his heart soften and moved to pity as he looked at the poor fellow. The landlady, sobbing and wailing like a peasant woman at her forlorn condition, laid the invalid back in bed with her own hands. Mark Ivanovitch, seeing the uselessness of touching upon the memory of Napoleon, instantly relapsed into kindliness and came to her assistance. The others, in order to do something, suggested raspberry tea, saying that it always did good at once and that the invalid would like it very much. But Zimuvikin contradicted them all, saying there was nothing better than a good dose of chamomile or something of the sort. As for Zinovy Prokofyevitch, having a good heart, he sobbed and shed tears in his remorse for having frightened Semyon Ivanovitch with all sorts of absurdities, and gathering from the invalid's last words that he was quite poor and needing assistance, he proceeded to get up a subscription for him, confining it for a time to the tenants of the flat. Everyone was sighing and moaning. Everyone felt sorry and grieved, and yet all wondered how it was a man could be so completely panic-stricken. And what was he frightened about? It would have been all very well if he had had a good post, had had a wife, a lot of children. It would have been excusable if he were being hauled up before the court on some charge or other. But he was a man utterly insignificant, with nothing but a trunk and a German lock. He had been lying more than 20 years behind his screen, saying nothing, knowing nothing of the world nor of trouble, saving his halfpence, and now at a frivolous, idle word the man had actually gone off his head, was utterly panic-stricken at the thought he might have a hard time of it. And it never occurred to him that everyone has a hard time of it. If he would only take that into consideration, Okanov said afterwards, that we all have a hard time, then the man would have kept his head, would have given up his antics, and would have put up with things, one way or another. All day long nothing was talked of but Semyon Ivanovitch. They went up to him, inquired after him, tried to comfort him, but by the evening he was beyond that. The poor fellow began to be delirious, feverish. He sank into unconsciousness, so that they almost thought of sending for a doctor. The lodgers all agreed together and undertook to watch over Semyon Ivanovitch and soothe him by turns through the night, and if anything happened to wake all the rest immediately. With the object of keeping awake, they sat down to cards, setting beside the invalid his friend, the drunken cadger, who had spent the whole day in the flat and had asked leave to stay the night. As the game was played on credit and was not at all interesting, they soon got bored. They gave up the game, then got into an argument about something, then began to be loud and noisy, finally dispersed to their various corners, went on for a long time angrily shouting and wrangling, and as all of them felt suddenly ill-humored, they no longer cared to sit up, so went to sleep. Soon it was as still in the flat as in an empty cellar, and it was the more like one because it was horribly cold. The last to fall asleep was Okanov, and it was between sleeping and waking, as he said afterwards, I fancied just before morning 2 men kept talking close by me. Okanov said that he recognized Zimuvikin, and that Zimuvikin began waking his old friend Remnev just beside him, that they talked for a long time in a whisper. Then Zimuvikin went away and could be heard trying to unlock the door into the kitchen. The key, the landlady declared afterwards, was lying under her pillow and was lost that night. Finally, Okanov testified he had fancied he had heard them go behind the screen to the invalid and light a candle there. And I know nothing more, he said. I fell asleep and woke up, as everybody else did, when everyone in the flat jumped out of bed at the sound behind the screen of a shriek that would have roused the dead, and it seemed to many of them that a candle went out at that moment. A great hubbub arose, everyone's heart stood still. They rushed pell-mell at the shriek, but at that moment there was a scuffle, with shouting, swearing, and fighting. They struck a light and saw that Zimuvikin and Remnev were fighting together, that they were swearing and abusing one another, and as they turned the light on them, one of them shouted, "It's not me, it's this ruffian," and the other, who was Zimuvikin, was shouting, "Don't touch me, I've done nothing. I'll take my oath any minute." Both of them looked hardly like human beings, but for the first minute they had no attention to spare for them. The invalid was not where he had been behind the screen. They immediately parted the combatants and dragged them away, and saw that Mr. Prohartchin was lying under the bed. He must, while completely unconscious, have dragged the quilt and pillow after him so that there was nothing left on the bedstead but the bare mattress, old and greasy. He never had sheets. They pulled Semyon Ivanovitch out, stretched him on the mattress, but soon realized that there was no need to make trouble over him, that he was completely done for. His arms were stiff, and he seemed all to pieces. They stood over him. He still faintly shuddered and trembled all over, made an effort to do something with his arms, could not utter a word, but blinked his eyes as they say heads do when still warm and bleeding, after being just chopped off by the executioner. At last the body grew more and more still. The last faint convulsions died away. Mr. Prohartchin had set off with his good deeds and his sins. Whether Semyon Ivanovitch had been frightened by something, whether he had had a dream, as Rimnev maintained afterwards, or there had been some other mischief nobody knew. All that can be said is that if the head clerk had made his appearance at that moment in the flat and had announced that Semyon Ivanovitch was dismissed for sedition, insubordination, and drunkenness, if some old draggle-tailed beggar woman had come in at the door, calling herself Semyon Ivanovitch's sister-in-law, or if Semyon Ivanovitch had just received 200 rubles as a reward, or if the house had caught fire and Semyon Ivanovitch's head had been really burning, he would in all probability not have deigned to stir a finger in any of these eventualities. While the first stupefaction was passing over, while all present were regaining their powers of speech, were working themselves up into a fever of excitement, shouting and flying to conjectures and suppositions, while Ustinya Fyodorovna was pulling the box from under his bed, was rummaging in a fluster under the mattress, and even in Semyon Ivanovitch's boots. While they cross-questioned Rimnev and Zimuvikin, Okanov, who had hitherto been the quietest, humblest, and least original of the lodgers, suddenly plucked up all his presence of mind and displayed all his latent talents, by taking up his hat and under cover of the general uproar slipping out of the flat. And just when the horrors of disorder and anarchy had reached their height in the agitated flat, till then so tranquil, the door opened and suddenly there descended upon them, like snow upon their heads, a personage of gentlemanly appearance, with a severe and displeased-looking face. Behind him Yaroslav Ilyitch, behind Yaroslav Ilyitch his subordinates and the functionaries whose duty it is to be present on such occasions, and behind them all, much embarrassed, Mr. Okanov. The severe-looking personage of gentlemanly appearance went straight up to Semyon Ivanovitch, examined him, made a wry face, shrugged his shoulders, and announced what everybody knew, that is, that the dead man was dead, only adding that the same thing had happened a day or two ago to a gentleman of consequence, highly respected, who had died suddenly in his sleep. Then the personage of gentlemanly, but displeased-looking, appearance walked away saying that they had troubled him for nothing, and took himself off. His place was at once filled, while Rimnev and Zimuvikin were handed over to the custody of the proper functionaries, by Yaroslav Ilyitch, who questioned someone, adroitly took possession of the box, which the landlady was already trying to open, put the boots back in their proper place. Observing that they were all in holes and no use, asked for the pillow to be put back, called up Okanov, asked for the key of the box which was found in the pocket of the drunken cadger, and solemnly, in the presence of the proper officials, unlocked Semyon Ivanovitch's property. Everything was displayed. 2 rags, a pair of socks, half a handkerchief, an old hat, several buttons, some old soles, and the uppers of a pair of boots, that is, all sorts of odds and ends, scraps, rubbish, trash, which had a stale smell. The only thing of any value was the German lock. They called up Okanov and cross-questioned him sternly, but Okanov was ready to take his oath. They asked for the pillow, they examined it. It was extremely dirty, but in other respects it was like all other pillows. They attacked the mattress, they were about to lift it up, but stopped for a moment's consideration, when suddenly and quite unexpectedly something heavy fell with a clink on the floor. They bent down and saw on the floor a screw of paper, and in the screw some dozen rubles. Hey, said Yaroslav Ilyitch, pointing to a slit in the mattress from which hair and stuffing were sticking out. They examined the slit and found that it had only just been made with a knife and was half a yard in length. They thrust hands into the gap and pulled out a kitchen knife, probably hurriedly thrust in there after slitting the mattress. Before Yaroslav Ilyitch had time to pull the knife out of the slit and to say, hey. Again, another screw of money fell out, and after it, one at a time, 2 half rubles, a quarter ruble, then some small change, and an old-fashioned, solid 5-kopeck pisol. This was seized upon. At this point it was realized that it would not be amiss to cut up the whole mattress with scissors. They asked for scissors. Meanwhile, the guttering candle lighted up a scene that would have been extremely curious to a spectator. About a dozen lodgers were grouped round the bed in the most picturesque costumes, all unbrushed, unshaven, unwashed, sleepy-looking, just as they had gone to bed. Some were quite pale, while others had drops of sweat upon their brows. Some were shuddering, while others looked feverish. The landlady, utterly stupefied, was standing quietly with her hands folded waiting for Yaroslav Ilyitch's good pleasure. From the stove above, the heads of Avditia, the servant, and the landlady's favorite cat looked down with frightened curiosity. The torn and broken screen lay cast on the floor, the open box displayed its uninviting contents. The quilt and pillow lay tossed at random, covered with fluff from the mattress, and on the three-legged wooden table gleamed the steadily growing heap of silver and other coins. Only Semyon Ivanovitch preserved his composure, lying calmly on the bed and seeming to have no foreboding of his ruin. When the scissors had been brought and Yaroslav Ilyitch's assistant, wishing to be of service, shook the mattress rather impatiently to ease it from under the back of its owner, Semyon Ivanovitch, with his habitual civility, made room a little, rolling on his side with his back to the searchers. Then at a second shake he turned on his face, finally gave way still further, and as the last slat in the bedstead was missing, he suddenly and quite unexpectedly plunged head downward, leaving in view only two bony, thin, blue legs, which stuck upwards like two branches of a charred tree. As this was the second time that morning that Mr. Prohartchin had poked his head under his bed, it at once aroused suspicion, and some of the lodgers, headed by Zinovy Prokofyevitch, crept under it, with the intention of seeing whether there were something hidden there too. But they knocked their heads together for nothing, and as Yaroslav Ilyitch shouted to them, bidding them release Semyon Ivanovitch at once from his unpleasant position, two of the more sensible seized each a leg, dragged the unsuspected capitalist into the light of day, and laid him across the bed. Meanwhile the hare and flock were flying about, the heap of silver grew, and, my goodness, what a lot there was. Noble silver rubles, stout solid ruble-and-a-half pieces, pretty half-ruble coins, plebeian quarter rubles, 20 kopeck pieces, even the unpromising old crone's small fry of 10 and 5 kopeck silver pieces, all done up in separate bits of paper in the most methodical and systematic way. There were curiosities also, 2 counters of some sort, 1 Napoleon d'or, 1 very rare coin of some unknown kind. Some of the rubles were of the greatest antiquity. They were rubbed and hacked coins of Elizabeth, German kreutzers, coins of Peter, of Catherine. There were, for instance, old 15 kopeck pieces, now very rare, pierced for wearing as earrings, all much worn, yet with the requisite number of dots. There was even copper, but all of that was green and tarnished. They found 1 red note, but no more. At last, when the dissection was quite over, and the mattress case had been shaken more than once without a clink, they piled all the money on the table and set to work to count it. At the first glance one might well have been deceived and have estimated it at 1,000,000. It was such an immense heap. But it was not 1,000,000, though it did turn out to be a very considerable sum, exactly 2497 rubles, and a half so, that if Zinovy Prokofyevitch's subscription had been raised the day before there would perhaps have been just 2,500 rubles. They took the money, they put a seal on the dead man's box, they listened to the landlady's complaints, and informed her when and where she ought to lodge information in regard to the dead man's little debt to her. A receipt was taken from the proper person. At that point hints were dropped in regard to the sister-in-law. But being persuaded that in a certain sense the sister-in-law was a myth, that is, a product of the defective imagination with which they had more than once reproached Semyon Ivanovitch, they abandoned the idea as useless, mischievous, and disadvantageous to the good name of Mr. Prohartchin. And so the matter ended. When the first shock was over, when the lodgers had recovered themselves and realized the sort of person their late companion had been, they all subsided, relapsed into silence, and began looking distrustfully at one another. Some seemed to take Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior very much to heart, and even to feel affronted by it. What a fortune! So the man had saved up like this. Not losing his composure, Mark Ivanovitch proceeded to explain why Semyon Ivanovitch had been so suddenly panic-stricken, but they did not listen to him. Zinovy Prokofyevitch was very thoughtful. Okanov had had a little to drink. The others seemed rather crestfallen, while a little man called Kanterv, with a nose like a sparrow's beak, left the flat that evening after very carefully packing up and cording all his boxes and bags, and coldly explaining to the curious that times were hard and that the terms here were beyond his means. The landlady wailed without ceasing, lamenting for Semyon Ivanovitch and cursing him for having taken advantage of her lorn state. Mark Ivanovitch was asked why the dead man had not taken his money to the bank. "He was too simple, my good soul, he hadn't enough imagination," answered Mark Ivanovitch. "Yes, and you have been too simple too, my good woman," Okanov put in. "For 20 years, the man kept himself close here in your flat, and here he's been knocked down by a feather while you went on cooking cabbage soup and had no time to notice it." "Ah, my good woman." "Oh, the poor dear," the landlady went on, "what need of a bank? If he'd brought me his pile and said to me, 'Take it, Ustinushka, poor dear, here is all I have, keep and board me in my helplessness, so long as I am on earth,' then, by the holy Icon, I would have fed him, I would have given him drink, I would have looked after him. Ah, the sinner. Ah, the deceiver. He deceived me, he cheated me, a poor lone woman." They went up to the bed again. Semyon Ivanovitch was lying properly now, dressed in his best, though indeed it was his only suit, hiding his rigid chin behind a cravat which was tied rather awkwardly, washed, brushed but not quite shaven, because there was no razor in the flat. The only one, which had belonged to Zinovy Prokofyevitch, had lost its edge a year ago and had been very profitably sold at Tolkachi market. The others used to go to the barber's. They had not yet had time to clear up the disorder. The broken screen lay as before, and exposing Semyon Ivanovitch's seclusion seemed like an emblem of the fact that death tears away the veil from all our secrets, our shifty dodges and intrigues. The stuffing from the mattress lay about in heaps. The whole room, suddenly so still, might well have been compared by a poet to the ruined nest of a swallow, broken down and torn to pieces by the storm, the nestlings and their mother killed, and their warm little bed of fluff, feather, and flock scattered about them. Semyon Ivanovitch, however, looked more like a conceited, thievish old cock-sparrow. He kept quite quiet now, seemed to be lying low, as though he were not guilty, as though he had had nothing to do with the shameless, conscienceless, and unseemly duping and deception of all these good people. He did not heed now the sobs and wailing of his bereaved and wounded landlady. On the contrary, like a wary, callous capitalist, anxious not to waste a minute in idleness even in the coffin, he seemed to be wrapped up in some speculative calculation. There was a look of deep reflection in his face, while his lips were drawn together with a significant air, of which Semyon Ivanovitch during his lifetime had not been suspected of being capable. He seemed, as it were, to have grown shrewder. His right eye was, as it were, slyly screwed up. Semyon Ivanovitch seemed wanting to say something, to make some very important communication and explanation, and without loss of time, because things were complicated and there was not a minute to lose. And it seemed as though they could hear him. "What is it? Give over, do you hear, you stupid woman? Don't whine. Go to bed and sleep it off, my good woman, do you hear? I am dead, there's no need of a fuss now. What's the use of it, really? It's nice to lie here. Though I don't mean that, do you hear? You are a fine lady, you are a regular fine lady. Understand that. Here I am dead now, but look here, what if that is, perhaps it can't be so, but I say, what if I'm not dead, what if I get up, do you hear? What would happen then?" Transcriber's notes. The list of novels translated by Constance Garnett was moved from front of book to the end. Punctuation was standardized. Spaces were removed from ellipses when used to separate syllables within a word, e.g. sus, pick, iron. Archaic and non-standard spelling was retained, except as noted below. Changes to text. Grandchilid to grandchild. I tell you this, grandchild. Terrestrial to terrestrial. Whole terrestrial globe. Consciousness to consciousness. To your consciousness. Gentleman to gentleman. I knew a gentleman who. Extraordinary to extraordinarily. Everything will be extraordinarily rational. Free will to free will for consistency with remaining text. Without free will and without. So-called free will. And to am. Am I a scoundrel? Tu tatua. Where will the poor fellow be off to? Cried to cries. I heard cries of bewilderment. Intergiu to intrigue. The intrigue was not such. Additions to text. Added missing too. If not today. Added missing. It was a waste of time.